Alyssa's Cell, The Gilded Cage, written by S.P. Butterworth, edited by Catherine. Self-published. Copyright 2021. Chapter 1, My Gilded Cage. Here I am on a rainy Tuesday afternoon sitting in my gilded cage all snuggled up behind a woolen blanket with a mug of hot cocoa. This is pure bliss. I feel so safe and protected in my gilded cage. Well, actually, it's not a cage. It's a large cell at about 12 by 16 feet, but I am behind bars. I know I can't leave my cell, but I don't really want to either. My cell is my home, and it's super comfy and cozy. So let me try and describe it to you. On one side of my cell, I have a soft bed with a memory foam mattress and micro quilt cover. Sounds comfy, right? That's because it is. At the back of my cell is a small barred window overlooking the facility in which I live with barbed wire and an electric fence beyond it, as well as a couple of watchtowers. Beneath the barred window is my desk and chair, which I use to draw, read, and do lots of other cool stuff. Not far away, I have my own small television set. In fact, it is quite tiny, but that's okay. It's just me locked up in this cell, so I have it all to myself. I am a bit of a news junkie, so I love watching the news, which is strange and unusual for an 18-year-old girl. But I love to know what's going on in the outside world, knowing that I am cozy and comfortable locked in my own cell. I also have a super soft carpet. It's a kind of creamy color, so I need to be careful not to get any stains on it. The carpet is made from a thick shag material and is really nice just to lay down on. My cell is furnished but simple, and although I am locked inside for 23 hours a day, I feel that this is my snug little home and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. That's why I call it my gilded cage. I am locked in behind bars just like a caged animal, but I also have everything I need to be happy and secure. I do not need physical freedom. Physical freedom is harmful to me, and being locked up in this cell has been the greatest thing that has ever happened to me. It's like how a lion loves his den or a dog loves her crate. Some monkeys love being caged up in zoos because of the easy, relaxed lifestyle and lack of predators. Some research has proven that hens are actually happier being in cages than being free range. Free range hens are nervous, paranoid wrecks. They shift around, terrified of predators such as foxes or owls in their open field, literally waiting for death. Caged hens, on the other hand, live in warm, comfortable cages with a constant supply of food. If cages make animals happy, as scientific research has proven, then surely cells like mine can only do the same for young women such as myself. This is as long as the cell is furnished, comfortable, and designed to protect women from the outside world, as opposed to protecting the outside world from criminals like we see in prison. Although I am locked up in my cell in an institution for young women, I am not in a prison. This is not for my punishment. This is to protect me from the evils of society. This gilded cage protects me and welcomes me, as it does for all of the other women in this institution too, locked in gilded cages of their own. On my row, there are 11 other cells just like mine with all of the same style of furnishings. The cells are kind of laid out into rows facing each other. My cell is the one at the end, which means that I have another resident next to me in her cell, and of course another girl opposite me in her cell too. All cells are old-fashioned in their exterior. They all have bars like in a traditional prison, but this is really cool because it means we can still see each other and communicate super easily. Each cell has a heavy metal iron sliding door, which is only open and closed by traditional lock and key. Here we are in the 21st century, living in a cell which can be opened by lock and key, just like Victorian times. It is like living in a museum sometimes with such old technology, but I am a bit of a history buff, so I think it's really cool to be locked up like this. I love the sound of my cell door shutting. The fast clanking sound of the cell door fills me with such exhilaration. It's a beautiful, mechanical sound that reminds me every day why I am locked up in this cell. Each time I'm locked in by the facility officer, I know it's for my own benefit, for my own comfort and protection, as I am locked in my cell to be protected from the evil elements of society. In fact, all of us girls living here are protected and cared for, including my cell block neighbors. Gwen lives in the cell next to mine. She is a cute, quiet type from some tiny village in rural England. She has shoulder-length dark brown hair with a cute, round face. She is really slender and has an amazing butt, but her breasts are quite small. Her butt totally makes up for it though. Gwen's cell is basically her world, and when she has to leave the cell to do some chores or take a shower, she looks visibly uncomfortable when she starts to get shackled up. Actually, she's a wrist and ankle shackle kind of girl. She likes her shackles simple but feels a little bit uncomfortable with her full body shackles on. But in my book, that's okay. All of us girls here are not the same. We all have our preferences. But that's okay here. It is okay to be whatever you want to be at this facility. Her artwork is absolutely stunning. She loves to draw art from a first-person perspective. Sometimes she would look out of her cell and draw whatever is in front of her with amazing detail. Every shade would be used to express whatever she sees. Gwen is definitely suited to being in her cell. She doesn't like to leave it at all. I call her my little caged bird. In the opposite cell, we have Octavia. She is from some tiny valley town in Wales. I don't quite remember. Octavia's crazy. She is basically like my sister. She is funny, quirky, super hyper, and just plain crazy. I love her so much. Even though her cell is directly opposite mine, we are only 6 meters apart, so we can still talk, chat, dance to music, and gossip sometimes too. Octavia is really cute. She is really quite short, slender, with a really flexible body, but it's not an unhealthy pale kind of skinny. Her torso is so long and slender, and she has shoulder-length, dirty blonde hair. Her breasts are probably a B cup, but she makes up for that shortfall in her amazing dexterity. She has quite a posh English, received pronunciation accent, but she is really from the upper-lower middle class. Like me, she loves living in the facility. She is a spiritual sort of person, practicing yoga and meditating often. Octavia does this strange yoga where she uses the bars of her cell to achieve different yoga positions. She can hang off the top, horizontal bar of her cell with just her feet for about 3 minutes straight. When she meditates, it's obviously impossible to sit cross-legged with those leg shackles on, so she meditates lying down instead, trying to focus on her breathing. Octavia is definitely a free spirit, free in her mind, and according to her, free in body too. She loves living in the facility just like me, and she really inspires me. But enough about them. I'm kind of egocentric, so I'll continue talking about myself for now. It's a wonderful facility. All residents must be shackled at all times. In our cells, we wear wrist and leg shackles that are permanently bolted on. While a resident in this facility, our shackles never come off. Only when we leave the facility are our shackles removed. And, in my opinion, my shackles are quite nice. I'll tell you why. A chain on my wrist shackles is like 45 centimeters long, so I can move my arms around quite well. I'm super grateful for these nice wrist shackles. I am forced to use my arms in a more controlled fashion so I don't harm myself or others. My leg shackles are really generous too. The chain on my leg shackles is slightly longer than my wrist shackles, around 50 centimeters. This means I can walk around my cell and the facility in a way that is more ladylike. I am prevented from running around or kicking, meaning that my shackles force me to control my behavior and act more dignified. Only with these shackles can I act like a real lady. I love wearing them so much. Did you know that when I have to leave my cell, I must wear full-body shackles? That's right. That's a neck collar with a chain connected to my wrist shackles, then another chain connected to my ankle shackles. So many chains and shackles. It sounds like jingle bells whenever I walk in all of these shackles, but that's okay. I understand why I must be fully shackled whenever I leave my cell. I understand that it's to keep myself and others safe from the evil temptations of society. The full-body shackles make me really aware of how I walk, ensuring that each step is carefully coordinated and dignified. It's a kind of psychological training. Without these full-body shackles, my behavior might be uncontrolled and I could do something reactionary or regretful. That's why I love my shackles so much. The moral good of wearing shackles outweighs the alleged discomfort that some uneducated outsiders claim. Often the people that are most critical of shackles are the ones who have never worn them before. They claim that the full-time shackling of residents in this facility is inhumane and an affront to our human rights. But little do they realize that often we need to take away any physical rights, such as the freedom of physical movement, in order to achieve greater internal, more psychological freedoms. I feel more freedom locked in my cell, wearing arm and leg shackles, than I would do in the outside world, where we would live in a vulnerable, hostile environment surrounded by bad influences. This is the life we have at this facility. Specifically, it is called Facility Manthorpe. It's a residential housing facility for young, so-called subordinate women, located in a village called Manthorpe, outside the town of Grantham, deep in the Lincolnshire countryside in England. So, how did me, an American girl from Lexington, Nebraska, end up here? Well, the reason is surprisingly political. Being half British, half American, my parents decided to move to England last year so I could go to university to study psychology at the University of Lincoln. Not so long after our arrival, an extreme right-wing government was elected into power in the United Kingdom on a morally ultra-conservative platform. This new government argued that all young women aged between 18 to 25 must be immediately interned in these prison-style buildings in order to protect us from what they called societal collapse caused by rampant debauchery in which females are most susceptible. The establishment of these facilities meant that I had to be legally transferred to Facility Manthorpe as I was about to turn 18 years old. Legally speaking, I am now what the government calls a subordinate, meaning that my legal rights have been stripped away to protect me from the moral decay of greater society. But strangely, I agree with what the government has done to me. I agree with the government's policy of forced removals of young women to these facilities. I have been protected from the dredges of society in which drug abuse, emotional manipulation, and radical feminist ideas of so-called equality have distorted the minds of young women, sowing confusion about their natural place in the world. As I sit in my cell, shackled by my wrists and ankles, I feel like a saved woman, saved from the misery of emotional manipulation that plagues Western society. Some of you are probably thinking that this facility is basically a prison. I mean, cells, bars, and shackles are all things we would associate with prison. The physical elements I have mentioned are associated with prison, but prison is for punishment. Prison removes bad elements from society to protect young women. In our case, subordinate facilities have the exact opposite purpose. Subordinate facilities are designed to remove young women from society to protect them from bad elements. Oh, in a psychological sense, it's the opposite of prison. They ensure young women are protected from the bad elements of society. None of the residents are allowed to leave the facility. In fact, we are confined to our cells most of the time, which is why they are so comfy and cozy. We are usually locked inside our cells for 23 hours a day. This means my cell has to be such a special and important place in which I must feel comfortable. I try to keep it clean and tidy, wiping down my desk and chair, as well as my bed frame. I even clean the bars of my cell, removing any rust and dirt that gets stuck there. There is even a little hoover that we share between the cells on our row, so my carpet is super clean. But what about laundry? Well, all residents wear a light cotton sleeveless frock with a Velcro side for comfortable fitting, so fashion here is really simple. We are given a few frocks each, so whenever I want my frock cleaning, I hand it over to Octavia, who does our laundry for our level. Each Saturday, Octavia is out of her cell and is fully shackled up by a facility officer. When her shackles are fully secured, the facility officer double-checks to see if Octavia's shackles are loose or faulty. If there are no problems, Octavia shuffles in her full-body shackles to a locked laundry room to hand-wash our frocks and hang them up to dry. When she's done, she requests for the laundry room door to be opened, and then an officer escorts her to outside her cell. She then enters her cell and the door is locked. Through the bars of the cell, the facility officer then reaches to unlock her neck collar, the chain connecting her neck collar and wrist shackles, and then the chain connecting her wrist shackles to her ankle shackles. And Octavia passes the neck collar and the massive chains through to the officer, who then takes the chains to the special shackles room where all of our shackles are kept. The next morning, the facility officer comes to Octavia's cell, gets her all shackled up like before, and then she again shuffles to the laundry room where she is again locked in. She spends about 20 minutes folding all of our frocks and then requests to leave the laundry room once more. Then she walks from cell to cell, passing the freshly laundered frocks through the bars of the girls' cells. As she does this, I can imagine how grateful the other girls are when they receive their clean frocks. Octavia makes our frocks smell really good, and they are always warm and soft when we get them. Because my cell is at the end of the row, I'm always last to get my frock. Every Sunday morning, I always hear Octavia's shackles get louder and louder as she shuffles towards my cell with my laundry. When she passes me my frock through the bars of my cell, she always greets me with a cheeky smile as I find out that she hides candy inside the frock. She is why I see her as such a good friend. Technically, passing candy through my cell like this is not allowed, but I don't see any harm, especially when it's those kinds of English toffees which I love so much. Sometimes we get a small thrill from bending the rules really slightly. The only harm eating candy does to me is ruin my teeth. As Octavia shuffles back to her cell, the facility officer repeats the usual routine of removing her neck collar and chains until a large mass of shackles is carried back to the shackles room. Octavia is super positive, always thanking the facility officer as she walks away weighed down by the bundle of chains, free from her full-body shackles but still restricted by her mandatory wrist and ankle shackles. She always takes a little nap after sorting out the laundry. Every time she takes a nap, she flops onto the bed like a starfish. Of course, her shackles don't allow her to stretch out her arms and legs completely, but that never seems to bother her. Like me, Octavia sees her shackles as an extension of her body, something that she can use to her advantage. Whilst being physically restricted, Octavia loves fiddling with her shackles, pulling, twisting, and turning at the metal links whenever she's reading, talking, or just relaxing. Naturally, our shackles jingle around a lot, so often the soothing, clinking sound of the shackles keeps her calm and relaxed. I love the sound of shackles, too. She also worries about the time when she will eventually have to leave the facility and her shackles will also be taken away from her. Octavia often tells me of her anxiety related to this and how it might feel like a finger or a limb being cut off if her shackles were removed. She often talks of the euphoric feeling she got when she first had her shackles bolted on. Admittedly, I'd felt equally exhilarated. Being shackled up permanently was one of my most favorite memories of all time. Chapter 2: Willful Submission. My arrival at Facility Manthorpe was one of apprehension and excitement. When the government announced the immediate internment of all unmarried, single young women aged between 18 and 25, I knew immediately that my life was going to change almost instantaneously. Like I said before, I was, and still am, a bit of a news junkie, so I had mentally anticipated this event for a while now. I remember on a muggy evening in June, a few weeks after the election of this ultra-conservative right-wing government, a newsflash came up on television demanding that all unmarried young women between 18 and 25 must report to the nearest police station immediately so that they can be detained and forcefully transported to the nearest subordinate facility for a mandatory 7 years of confinement. At the time, I had just finished eating my dinner and I was relaxing in the lounge with my parents. My parents, being hardcore supporters of this new government, immediately encouraged me to surrender to the nearest police station. I willfully did so without question, knowing fully that this government truly wanted the best for me, even if it meant giving up my freedoms and dreams. This act of willful submission was incredibly rare amongst 18-year-olds in Britain. In fact, most girls were terrified at the prospect of being taken away from their families, friends, careers, and studies. They were mortified at the prospect of putting their lives on hold in order to cater to the ideological desires of an extreme right-wing government, but most of these women didn't fully understand the real reason as to why they were to be interned in these facilities. They did not appreciate the real, almost compassionate reasons behind their own internment. It was to protect them from the debauchery of society. the bad influences and pressures that young women face in a world dominated by pimps, drug dealers, wife beaters, and promiscuity. The brains of young women are so malleable at that age of their lives. If they are locked away in institutions and protected from the moral breakdown of society, then their thinking can truly go uncorrupted. So many women simply didn't get that. They saw the process as a cynical ploy to control and strip away their rights, as if they were the Muslim Uyghurs in China or even the Jews during the Holocaust. This viewpoint was completely ridiculous, and I supported the opinion of the government that these morally diseased women had to be compassionately broken in a tough love sort of style. Anyway, I said goodbye to my parents, gave them a hug, and walked out of the door of my house, knowing that I would not see them for the next 7 years. I was feeling a little bit sad, but I knew that my upcoming internment had a purpose for my own moral good. At 7:30 p.m., I walked to Grantham Police Station, the closest one to my parents' house, and I was met by a truly depressing, if not personally annoying situation. There were about 150 women waiting outside, most of them distraught and visibly shaking. Some had been dumped there by their families, some by their boyfriends or now ex-boyfriends. A tiny minority came voluntarily and a handful came kicking and screaming. There were a lot of girls crying. Some were shouting expletives and others were just standing there in a catatonic state waiting to see what would happen next. I was a bit annoyed at the mental unpreparedness of the other girls. We really needed a reality check. They were here for their own good, to protect themselves from the society that had truly screwed up their brains. I had no sympathy for most of them. They seriously had to control their emotions. After waiting for about 10 minutes, a police officer ordered all of us girls to stand in a line, and we were called one by one into the police station. As I was the most eager, I was one of the first girls in line. The process went a little something like this. As soon as I entered the police station, a female policewoman put me in a pair of handcuffs. These were the typical rigid-style handcuffs that police use in the United Kingdom. They consisted of a pair of handcuffs connected by a rigid metal bar, which was enclosed in a kind of plastic grip secured with metal bolts. They were different from the chain-style handcuffs used in America. The officer used a sort of palm-to-palm position with these handcuffs, in which they were applied in the front of my body. The handcuffs clicked a few times, and by then I knew that I was officially detained. I didn't actually feel anything emotionally when I was handcuffed like this. It just felt like a procedure that was given to people that had broken the law, and I was used to seeing people in handcuffs all of the time whenever I watched those police shows on the television. So, it was okay. Next, I was passed to another officer who took my personal details down. I proudly told her that I was Alyssa Penton of Twitchfield Close, Grantham, as she typed up my name and address into the system database. She took my photo and then asked if I had any history of drug abuse, violence, or suicidal thoughts. Oh, no and no. I was a normal, functioning human being, inside and out. I was not prepared to bullshit some fake fucking illness in a vain attempt to get sympathy like so many other women tried to do. The next stage of processing is the most interesting one. A small team of psychologists, doctors, and police officers tried to determine what category of facility you should be sent to. The police officer sends you to a small room with a metal standing cage in the middle of it. It was in a bright steel stand-up cage with a metal door, about 2 meters tall and about 30 by 30 centimeters wide, so it was quite tall. Narrow cage with 4 vertical metal bars and 3 going across on all sides. One of the psychologists, who was really clinical looking, like a stereotype from a movie with round, Windsor glasses and slick-back auburn hair, told me in a sort of East European accent that I had to enter the cage for what they called a psychophysical categorization examination. He led me to the standing cage and opened the door, which swung open easily as if the metal hinges had been freshly oiled. I walked inside and stood on the direct center of this cage waiting for my next orders. He then closed the metal door, which made a slamming sound as it was done quite forcefully. A large, chunky padlock was then applied to secure the cage door. The psychologist then directed the police officer to remove my hinged handcuff, which in my opinion was a bit of a relief as they were on my wrists a little too tight and it caused some light bruising, which was a bit uncomfortable. The handcuffs were taken off and they were then passed through the bars of the cage. The psychologist, who at no point whatsoever introduced himself, ordered me to undress inside the cage. At this point, I knew that this was going to happen, and as I knew that this whole procedure was for my benefit, I willfully obliged to strip off in front of this team of strangers. Those women would be horrified at the prospect of being locked in this tiny standing cage, being asked to take off all of their clothes for a so-called psychophysical categorization examination, but at the back of my head, I knew it was for the greater good. It was for my moral emancipation for which I was so desperately striving for. At the time, I was wearing a kind of blue smock swing dress with a floral patterned ruffle hem, a feminine, cute casual sort of summer dress made for slender women such as myself. Underneath the dress, I was wearing a size 30 to F red plunge bra and a red G-string thong. I know that this would be the last time I would get to fully choose what kind of clothes I would wear, so as I started to strip off my clothes, I thought about what kind of clothing I would be issued next. I slipped off my dress over my head and passed it through the bars of the cage to one of the police officers staring down at me. At this point, I was only wearing my bra and a G-string thong. I then brought my arms behind me to unhook my plunge bra, and both of my F-cup breasts were free at last. I always loved the feeling of taking my bra off at the end of the day, as I consider my breasts to be larger than average for my body size. They are quite saggy, and when I sit down or bend over, they reach my belly button, so they flop around really easily. That's why I wear a plunge bra, to keep my breasts supported. So yeah, skinny body, big floppy breasts. I then had to take off my G-string thong. I began to reminisce about how much I loved wearing this style of thong. When I wear thongs, it really feels like I am wearing nothing at all. I love how light thongs are and how it makes my butt look. It's kind of embarrassing sometimes because whenever I wore low-rise jeans, the side strings of my thong always ride up, and I am always teased about how my G-string thong is showing. The same happens when I wear leggings too. I remember one time back in America, I was wearing leggings when I went shopping with my friends. I forgot that I was wearing a white G-string thong at the same time, and you could totally see my entire thong through the leggings, especially when I bent over. I have had a couple of thongs snap on me too. I remember trying to follow some crappy yoga video on YouTube when I tried to do a forward bend yoga pose. I attempted it, my thong started riding up and you could totally see my red whale tail out of my yoga pants. I then felt a snap. My G-string thong had totally snapped on its left side. I thought stupid underwear wardrobe malfunctions only happened to fat people, but there I was, a skinny size 8 girl with a broken thong failing at yoga. After I snapped out of my flashbacks of G-string thong memories, I slowly began to pull down my thong, with the thin red strings slowly sliding down my thighs. Once my thong fell down to my legs, I bent down and picked it up and handed it to the police officer, who put it in a gray plastic tray alongside my red plunge bra and blue dress. So there I was, standing in this cage, thongless, braless and dressless, completely naked and awaiting the next set of instructions. I was informed that a very short psychoanalytical assessment was going to take place. Almost immediately after, I was asked 3 simple questions by the psychologist. First question: how are you feeling right now? Excited and courageous, I answered. He then asked, do you serve the cause of the newly elected government in preventing societal collapse caused by rampant debauchery in which females are most susceptible? Yes, I serve the cause, I replied. In his third and final question, he asked, in 10 words or less, do you wish to tell us anything? Yes, sir, I do. Thank you for protecting me, I answered. The psychologist proclaimed the short psychoanalytical assessment to be over and made some notes on his clipboard. He then conferred with the doctors, police officers, and other psychologists for a few minutes, although I don't really know what they were saying. I tried to look beyond the bars of the cage to peek at the psychologist's clipboard because I was kind of curious regarding what notes he was taking, but he was too far away. Some time later, the psychologist told me that the physical categorization examination would commence. He took a sip of his coffee and began to very slowly walk around the exterior of the cage, mumbling to himself as he was doing so. He must have circled around the cage about 4 or 5 times before pausing momentarily to clean his glasses. As he circled once more, he stopped behind the cage and stood there for about 30 seconds, stroking his gray goatee beard. The psychologist ran his fingers along the bars of the cage, breathing heavily and muttering to himself as he was doing it, before returning to his desk where his clipboard lay. He wrote some more notes on the clipboard, and then the entire team of doctors, psychologists, and police officers left the room, leaving me completely naked and alone, only surrounded by the bars of the cage. During the physical examination, I reflected on the answers I gave during the psychological assessment and how it felt so euphoric to give direct and loyal answers to the psychologist's questions. Now that they had left the room, I felt an immense feeling of accomplishment as I was standing in this tiny cage alone with my wonderful thoughts, awaiting my fate. About 10 minutes later, the psychologists, doctors, and police officers returned back to the room. The psychologist walked up to the cage and announced that the doctor would now like to examine me. As the psychologist went back to his chair, the doctor immediately got up and walked to the cage. The doctor was quite young, maybe in her early 40s, with medium-length blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. She kind of looked like the type of doctor that works in the British National Health Service. Again, almost like a stereotype of what doctors should look like. She first asked me to stretch my arms up to the top bars of the cage and then down again. She then asked me to come close to the bars of the cage so she could examine my mouth, tongue, and tonsils, placing a wooden stick into my mouth to check for any abnormalities. I was then asked to jog on the spot for about 30 seconds so she could observe my mobility, so I started jogging, being careful to keep my center of balance as I was locked in a tiny standing cage. As I was jogging, I became somewhat conscious of my large, saggy breasts flopping around. Normally, when I jog, I use a sports bra and I am on a running machine. This time, I was completely naked in a tiny cage being examined by a doctor. After the time lapsed, I stopped and tried to catch my breath. The doctor handed me a small bottle of water through the bars of the cage so I could hydrate myself. I guzzled it down and handed the empty plastic bottle through the cage bars back to her. Next came the breast examination, which is really important as feminine health has always been a priority of mine. I was asked to come as close to the cage bars as possible and place each breast between the bars. As the bars of the cage were vertical and horizontal, I laid each breast resting on the horizontal bars. This sensation felt very cold and tingling, but also a little bit exhilarating. The doctor put on a pair of white gloves and slowly began squeezing each breast, rubbing her finger around the nipple. This again produced an unusual sensation, which felt really pleasurable. After about 30 seconds, the whole thing was over. She then told me to step back into the center of the cage and wait silently. As I was waiting in the cage, the team of experts conferred for about 5 minutes, mumbling away and pointing at the clipboard repeatedly. Eventually, one of the police officers walked up to the cage and asked me to present my hands to him so he could handcuff me once more. I gestured my hands in a palm-to-palm position and the officer reached through the bars of the cage and locked the hinged handcuffs into place. Standing in the cage, handcuffed and restrained once more, he then announced that I had performed very well in the psychophysical categorization examination, showing strong cognitive awareness and moral decency. Furthermore, he noted that I was as fit as a fiddle, emphasizing my healthy, slender figure and strong dexterity. Therefore, he said, I would be categorized as I-1, meaning that I fit all of the government's requirements as having full potential to progress into a morally dignified woman, best placed to resist temptation and debauchery. Of course, I was giddy with excitement when I heard of this diagnosis. I was kind of hopping up and down inside the cage with glee. As I clinched onto one of the bars of the cage in excitement with my handcuffed hands, I thought about how lucky I was that I was going to be sent to a so-called subordinate facility with other women who also scored I-1 on the psychophysical categorization examination. But what about the other women who didn't score as high on the examination? Well, the other categories are B2 and C3. The second category, B2, are usually the ones who are emotional, outspoken, or rebellious. Many of them were part of the problem in which they took drugs, drank alcohol, engaged in reckless sex, and were incorrectly politically orientated. Perhaps they would be unable to follow the rules of morality and believe that society would work for them instead of them working for society. That being said, it can be perfectly acceptable for women categorized as B2 to be physically healthy, fit, and slim, but it's more a disease of the mind in which generation snowflakes have come of age and are unable to function without damaging their own morals. So basically, when you think of B2, just think of environmental activists, vegans, socialists, emotionally incontinent snowflakes, and virtue signalers. These people get sent to a special facility for them, focusing on moral education and productive work labor. I think they will get a huge shock in the weeks to come. The final category is C3. A were categorized as C3. You were really the lowest of the low. C3 people are first and foremost physically unhealthy. They are fat, ugly, and just generally disgusting. They wake up late, eat fried garbage all day, such as potato chips, chocolate bars, burgers, and other processed crap. They are economically inactive and are generally miserable and annoying. They are usually of low intelligence, being too fat and stupid to work, and if they do work, it is in those crappy shitty jobs like retail or in a warehouse. Civil society does not need these kinds of people. Thank God our new noble and wise extreme far-right government has finally taken action against these people. C3 fatties get sent to their own facility too, in which they are given healthy food and have to exercise every day. Oh, more burgers and no more fried garbage. We are given one life and one body. Fat people don't respect this and think they can just eat whatever they want. After 7 years of confinement in their facility, they should come out as skinny, healthy, and educated, ready to be productive citizens. Now that my rant about the other categories is over, I can now take you back to my euphoric situation of acceptance into the I1 category. So, as the adrenaline of the diagnosis was still strong, the police officer said that I was only allowed to have my underwear back as the blue dress and plunge bra were forbidden items from this point on. He reached into the gray tray and passed my red G-string thong through the bars of the cage for me to wear once more. I knew that putting my thong back on while still handcuffed would be a really difficult challenge. With handcuffs, you can't just move your hands wherever you want. If one hand goes up, your other hand is forced to go up too. If you move one hand to scratch an itch on your shoulder, your other hand is forced to join too. So I had to coordinate my hands carefully in order to wear my thong once more. Firstly, I clenched my thong and bent down with my butt pressed against the side of the tiny standing cage and brought my handcuffed hands down to my right leg and kind of hopped into one of the red strings. I then awkwardly hopped into the right string and then straightened my back as I was sliding my thong up past the knees and my thighs. As I was doing this, my large, saggy F-cup breasts were nearly past my belly button, flopping around against my gentle, delicate, slender frame. I had to do all of this with my tight, hinged handcuffs in front of me. Once the weight of my G-string thong was up past my hips, I then had to bring my handcuffed wrist to one side and run my thumb underneath the left string of the thong to position it more appropriately. I then twisted my body to bring my wrist to the other hip to again adjust the right string. Success! I had successfully put my thong back on whilst fully secured and rigid handcuffed. I was so worried that I would fall over in the cage trying to maneuver my body doing this. It would have been so embarrassing. I kind of don't understand why I was not allowed to put on my thong while I was locked in the cage and handcuffed first and then be handcuffed afterwards, but apparently the police officer confused a step in the routine in which detainees can't be expected to put on items of clothing whilst wearing a pair of rigid handcuffs, but that's okay, I forgave him. We all make mistakes, right? The police officer then announced that he was going to open the door to the cage. I carefully stepped out, just wearing my red G-string thong, trying not to fall over as my hands were still handcuffed, and yes, it's sometimes hard to keep your balance when you wear these rigid-style handcuffs. I was escorted to one of the police station cells located in the basement. Nicknamed the holding pen, Grantham Police Station has a mass complex of over 200 cells located 20 feet below. These cells were originally a large prison during the Victorian times used for criminals waiting to be deported to penal colonies in Australia. Still handcuffed and wearing only my thong, the police officer led me down a narrow set of winding stairs. As we walked down, the lights were getting dimmer and dimmer, and the temperature was getting colder and colder. My nipples of my browless breasts were hardening, and we were descending further underground. My buttocks were lightly jingling as I was walking in just my red G-string thong. Soon we arrived at the holding pen with its candlelit corridors and echo atmosphere. As I observed the surroundings of this basement dungeon, I heard the crying, moaning, and even hysterical shouting from many of the young women in the cells. Clearly, many had been categorized as B2 or C3 because they didn't understand that their processing, examination, and confinement was for their own long-term benefit. They should have been privileged to be locked up in one of these cells ready for the new, exciting adventure in front of them, but instead they were bitching and whining all of the time they were there. Clearly, this was a result of years and years of brain rot from their own narcissistic lifestyles prior to coming here. I felt no pity for them. It became apparent that when processing and examination was complete, we had to spend one night locked up in one of these prison cells until we were transported to the appropriate facility the next morning. After passing corridors of prison cells about half occupied with young women only wearing their underwear, I was finally escorted to cell number 1 to 6, in which I entered with glee and excitement. The police officer then asked me to reach my arms through the bars of the cell so he could once again unlock the hinged handcuff. I did so, and with a twist of the key, my hands were finally free. I am not a big fan of rigid handcuffs, as the attempt to wear my thong resulted in some more light bruising of my wrists. There are restraints made for punishment and restraints made to protect not only our movements but our attitudes. Rigid handcuffs are for criminals and are therefore used for punishment. I was not a criminal, but at the same time, these restraints were the only resources Grantham Police Station had at their disposal, so I totally understood their situation. The processing and examination of these young women would be impossible without treating all of them the same. All young women must be handcuffed on arrival, caged during assessment, and locked up ready for transport to their facility. That's handcuffed, caged, locked up. 3 simple steps to a successful processing of detainees. All 3 of these things are for everyone's benefit in the long term, and I thought the police station did an excellent job in all of these forms of restraint. So thank you, Grantham Police Station, for trying your best. So here I am, 20 feet underground in a cold, damp Victorian prison cell, waiting to be transported the next morning. So, how was my cell? It was actually really basic. The cell was about 13 feet long by 7 feet wide, and the arched ceiling was about 9 feet high. The brick walls were painted a faded white, and there was a dim candle outside of my cell, providing a little bit of illumination. There was a simple cot-style bed at the back left-hand side of the cell, and a wooden table and chair in the corner. The floor of the cell was just a simple concrete, and as I was underground, there was no window. I was locked in a cell with long vertical bars keeping me inside. The gap between the bars was about 17 centimeters, and there was just one long horizontal bar running through the middle of the vertical bars. The bars of the cell were really cold and rusty. They had a slight dampness to them, and they were clearly made of old-fashioned, heavy cast iron. I had a metal bucket in my cell with a lid on top. This was pretty much my cell toilet. I had heard about some old prisons without plumbing using this method of bucket toilets. Apparently, every day prisoners had to slop out, meaning that they had to take their cell metal bucket and throw the urine and excrement down a communal drain. I wondered whether I had to do this too, as the smell of piss and shit fermenting would be very unpleasant after a day or so. As in A1 detainee, I was given complete freedom of limb movement inside my cell, with no handcuffs, shackles, or chains. Whilst I would have to get used to shackles later in the facility, the police officers, doctors, and psychologists deemed my behavior during processing to be satisfactory for my safety and the safety of others. Like I said, this police station and underground prison only had rigid handcuffs. Rigid handcuffs are usually for troublemakers and are only used on law-abiding, good citizens such as myself when there is no other choice. Two detainees were the most prone to be handcuffed whilst in the cell. During the psychological examination, careful considerations were made whether to determine if B2 category girls should be handcuffed into their prison cells. If they were perceived to be giving rebellious or antisocial answers to the psychologist's questions, or if they acted in a morally disobedient manner, they were to be placed in rigid handcuffs during their entire confinement in their prison cells. However, if a B2 detainee harbored very light or non-reactionary, seditious sentiments, then they may be allowed to be locked up inside their cell without the use of rigid handcuffs. T3 prisoners, on the other hand, were usually fat, lazy, stupid, and most of all passive. They were not passive as a result of their support for the government, its doctrine, and the effort to protect young women from debauchery, but they were passive because they neither had the brain power to intelligently rebel or the physical strength to do so. I kind of wondered how some of them even fit into that tiny standing cage during the examination phase. It actually was extremely rare for C2 prisoners to be handcuffed inside their cells. If they were both fat, lazy, stupid, and verbally aggressive against their treatment, then they were truly the lowest of the low. But I wanted to stop thinking about the fate of C2 prisoners because I thought I would vomit in my mouth if I continued. The cells were obviously a mix of different categories of detainees. Most of the cells in my row were occupied with detainees, so once I had settled into my old Victorian prison cell, I began to wonder who my neighbors were. After sitting on my rather hard and lumpy bed for some time, I began to circle my cell, taking in the atmosphere and the history of the place. I ran my long fingernails across the bars of the cell, feeling the bumps and scratches that these bars had developed over the past 150 years or so. I got as close to the bars of the cell as I could and peered out with my wrists resting on the main horizontal bar. I pressed my forehead against the vertical bars of the cell and looked at the opposite cell only 3 meters away. As I was locked up in an even-numbered cell, the cells opposite were of odd numbers, so I tried to see into cell 1 to 5. There was a girl inside the cell, quite tall with a lanky body. She was skinny, with long blonde hair, with a kind of angry, pissed-off look on her face. She was quite a young-looking 18-year-old with small breasts, perhaps an A-cup or something. She was pacing the cell, pacing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, like a caged lion, looking agitated and mumbling obscenities to herself. I tried not to stare at her too obviously as I was peering through the bars of my cell into hers. I watched her like a predator hiding behind a bush observing its prey out of abject curiosity. As I was doing so, I was trying to keep at least one of my eyes behind the vertical bars of my cell so it didn't look so blatant. As she was pacing up and down her prison cell, I squinted and noticed 2 interesting things. Firstly, she was wearing a white G-string thong, almost identical to mine, but the string of her thong was a little bit lopsided, meaning that probably she didn't pay a great deal of care or attention when she put it on inside the cage during the examination. The whale tail of the G-string was not riding high enough as it was too low down her buttocks. With G-strings, the side strings should be pulled up quite high, and the whale tail must be centered and positioned appropriately. Secondly, she was still restrained in a pair of rigid handcuffs like I was during processing. This meant that she was deemed by the staff of the police station to be a danger to herself and others. As she continued to pace around her prison cell, back and forth over and over again, she suddenly paused, looked down at the handcuffs she was wearing, and kept trying to either reposition them or slip out of them. She began to look frustrated as she kept twisting and turning at the impenetrable pair of rigid handcuffs. Her wrists were really skinny and she appeared to have great dexterity, but as much as she struggled in those handcuffs, she simply could not slip out of them. They were too tight and they were too secure. After about 10 minutes of struggling with those handcuffs of hers, she sat down on the floor of her prison cell and began alternating between biting her fingernails and twirling the left string of her thong as if she was thinking what to do next. It became clear that she was either beginning to break and to submit to her confinement and restraints, or she was thinking of a plan to act out and cause attention to herself, perhaps in an attempt to be removed from her prison cell. As I was carefully watching her, biting her nails, twisting her G-string, biting her nails, twisting her G-string, over and over and over again, her next step began to come into fruition. The girl suddenly stood up and began shouting at the top of her lungs. "These handcuffs are too tight. I can't move. Loosen these handcuffs." Her raspy voice echoed down the corridor of the aged Victorian prison cells, but nothing happened and no one came. "Take these fucking cuffs off. I am in a fucking prison cell. What the fuck am I going to do?" she shouted once more. Of course, the police officers just ignored her. They have to deal with this crap all of the time, even in normal prisons and jails, so they didn't really care. Next, after realizing that shouting at the top of her lungs was not going to work, she began trashing her cell. She picked up her toilet bucket and threw it at the bars of her cell, with a little bit of urine splashing onto the corridor. She picked it up and threw it again and again until it became slightly dented. As she was doing this, she shouted, "Take these cuffs off." Then she turned her attention to the furniture of her cell. She tried to flip her metal frame bed over, but failed miserably as she was too skinny and weak to lift it more than a few inches. The strain of her wrists from trying to lift heavy steel furniture whilst wearing handcuffs made her grunt in anger. "My fucking wrist. These fucking handcuffs. Fucking take them off," she shouted once more like a whiny little bitch. As I was watching this calamitous act of rebellion against her basic living conditions, I kept thinking about those prison documentaries I used to watch back in America. Every stupid inmate locked in solitary confinement would follow a similar process as the girl opposite my cell. Complain about something minuscule to get a reaction. When that doesn't work, start smashing up cell furniture. And when just as you think every other option is exhausted, flood the cell by blocking the toilet, which inevitably leads to a cell extraction, which results in further solitary confinement. Thankfully, this girl could not flood her cell as she didn't have a toilet connected to modern plumbing, so instead she began to smash her wooden chair against the wall of the cell. As she did this, with her handcuffs still on, pieces of wood flew everywhere, with the legs of the chair ricocheting off the bars of the cell. She then picked up the chair legs and began flinging them outside the cell into the prison corridor, causing an obstruction and making a mess. Soon, her cell was a complete mess. Pieces of wood, pools of piss, rust, and metal everywhere. She had acted like a crazy monkey locked in a tiny cage in a laboratory, and I had no sympathy whatsoever. This was her cell. He should respect the furniture in the cell and not disturb the other detainees or the police officers. When she had finished smashing the living shit out of her prison cell, I heard marching footsteps coming down the corridor. As the footsteps began to multiply, I saw 3 large, burly men in police officer uniforms and a female police officer carrying a camcorder. One of the men unlocked this girl's prison cell, walking straight through a puddle of piss, and pretty much tackled the bitch to the ground by using a tiger-tail karate sweep to make her fall backwards on her butt. She screamed, "You assaulted me. What the fuck?" as her white thong and buttocks were dirtied by the fall to the dirty floor of her cell. Almost immediately, the 2 other male police officers pinned her to the ground, removed her handcuffs, which were in the palm-to-palm position, and Ray secured the handcuffs behind her back, completely disabling her arms. One of the officers pulled out a pair of lightweight prison-issued shackles that had to be borrowed at short notice from nearby Sleaford Police Station about 20 minutes away by car and secured her skinny, slender legs. She was now handcuffed behind her back and restrained by a pair of shackles. She could learn not to kick. The girl was escorted head bowed down outside of her wrecked prison cell and down the corridor, screaming and yelling profanities as she shuffled quickly in her little shackles. What a pathetic sight. If you don't know how to use your arms properly, they must be tightly handcuffed. If you don't know how to use your legs properly, then you have your legs shackled by a police officer like a sad little bitch. Try kicking and running in those shackles, you little whore. I never saw her again, and to this day I still have no idea what happened to her. I was not aware of any solitary confinement facility at this underground prison, but they did have a tiny standing cage, so I guess they could have locked her in there for a few days wearing just her little white G-string thong to teach her a lesson. That was my suggestion anyway. Clearly, the freedom of her locked inside a normal Victorian prison cell was too much room for her, so if she was locked in a tiny cage, it would be impossible to trash and destroy the environment around her. Nevertheless, the girl in cell 1 to 5 was gone, and all I could see in front of me was a trashed, empty prison cell. Not long after she was extracted from her cell, I began to hear another sound coming down the corridor. It sounded like a wheel slowly squeaking on a trolley, moving and stopping periodically. As it was late evening, I made the correct prediction that it was dinner time for the detainees in the underground prison system. I began to smell the scent of gravy drifting through the corridors. An older lady, probably employed locally in a semi-retirement position, was wheeling an airplane-style trolley with her meals. This was great news, as I was really hungry by this time and I needed some nourishment after witnessing that liberal vegan snowflake having a tantrum about her handcuffed. Finally, the lady arrived outside my cell with a hard-thick plastic tray covered with aluminum foil. She slid the tray underneath the door of the prison cell and then wheeled the trolley away to the next occupied cell. I got up from the bed and bent over to pick up the tray of food and brought it to the old wooden table and chair in the left corner of the cell. It was quite a hot tray of food, but I was eager to peel away the foil as fast as I could and see what was underneath. As a waft of steam escaped from under the foil, I knew that I was going to be treated to the finest dining at Grantham Police Station. It was a hamburger-style steak made with mystery meat. Super soft hybrid boiled or mashed potatoes, hard salty broccoli, and a small cup of fluorescent super sweet teeth rotting orange cordial style juice beverage. I was not expecting a Michelin star buffet, so this nourishing meal should suit me just fine. I sat down on the wooden chair, which was really creaky and cold, as my G-string clad buttocks would soon discover. I used a really super thick plastic spoon provided on the meal tray to dig into what would be my final meal before being transferred to the facility the next morning. After my delicious prison dinner, I relieved myself in the bucket toilet provided to me. I removed the lid of the bucket, used both of my index fingers to run underneath both of the strings of my thong at the same time, and slid my G-string down my thighs, past my knees, and further down past my shins. As my red G-string thong had fallen to my feet, I picked it up with my right hand and placed it carefully on the bed. I didn't want to just leave my G-string thong sitting on the floor, as I didn't want it to get dirty like the other girl's white thong. I then maneuvered myself carefully over the metal bucket, resting my now thongless buttocks over the smoothed exterior rim. I then released my bladder, expelling all of the urine in my system and lightly groaning at the same time as I was doing it. It felt so good. I must have peed for about 20 seconds, and as I was doing so, I could hear the sound of water splattering into the tin metal bucket. It was really loud, so perhaps some of the locked-up girls in the occupied prison cells near me would definitely have heard me pee, but as I nearly finished peeing, the sound became more like a muffled trickle as the bucket had filled up sufficiently. When I looked down into the bucket to see how much I peed, I must have expelled about 500 milliliters of beautiful, hot, golden piss. I then put the lid back on the now filled bucket of piss, used a small, one-ply piece of toilet paper provided to me in my cell to wipe myself, threw that to one side, and then stood up so I could fetch my red G-string thong, which was waiting for me on my bed. I then picked up the tiny thong, hopped one of my left legs into one of the strings, pulled it up slightly past my shins, and then hopped into the right string and gently slid my thong up past my knees, my thighs, and then finally slipped it past my hips. I ran my thumb and my index finger along the side strings of my thong to make sure the strings were not lopsided, and then positioned the strings so that they were just above my hip bone. I then positioned the whale tail of my thong to make sure it was centered above the middle of my buttocks. My cute, Rachy string thong was on and I was looking and feeling fabulous. I was reminded a few hours ago about how I had to try to put my thong on in that tiny standing cage with those handcuffs on. That was really difficult, but without handcuffs and just locked in a regular underground prison cell, still behind bars, I was able to put my thong on without any problem. I considered myself an expert in putting on a G-string thong in both a tiny standing cage while I was handcuffed and now in a regular prison cell without any form of restraints. I soon began to feel tired, with no visible signs of any other girls locked in the cells opposite me or locked in next to me. I prepared myself for a long night in my cell in this underground prison. My bed was like a simple cot with a heavy cast iron frame, a thin, slightly stained mattress, and a thick, itchy woolen blanket. My descent into sleepy time was somewhat unremarkable. I did a little bit of stretching, twisting my slender frame from side to side, and then reached down to touch my toes, with my large, saggy breasts flopping around in front of me as I was doing so. I peered out of my prison cell once more, pressing my face and my breasts against the cold, hard, vertical bars, starting my eyes back and forth just to see if I had any neighbors, but I didn't see anyone this time. I only heard some odd shouting or clanking of a prison cell door further down the corridor. At this point, I was sure that I was going to have a great night's sleep, all safe and secure, locked up in a prison cell. I circled my cell a couple of times and then climbed into my bed for the night, pulling the old, woolen blanket over my nearly naked body. As I lay there, I reflected on the day I had, from the television announcement to processing, getting handcuffed for the first time, being examined in a tiny little cage, being told that I was categorized as A1, and then being escorted to my underground prison cell, witnessing that white G-string thong girl trash her cell like a caged animal, and then enjoying my delicious prison meal. I didn't only want to reflect. I also wanted to anticipate what would happen after I wake up tomorrow. Where would I be transported to? Will I need to be handcuffed again during my journey to the new facility? Would I be getting a really nice cell to live in? Or would I have to spend my next 7 years locked up in a tiny cage? Will I have cellmates or even cage mates? What clothes would I wear? And I still wear my G-string thong. What about food? Exercise? All of these things were circling in my head as I was drifting off to sleep. And then, as the candlelight outside my prison cell was burning out, I finally entered a deep slumber, off to dreamland. Chapter 3. Shackled for Transport. I woke up in my cell at what I thought was the middle of the night, but I was sure as I had no way of telling the time, as my brain had not woken up enough to register where I was. At first, I thought I was still at home in my parents' house, laying in my queen-size bed under a goose feather blanket. After a few seconds of confusion, I looked around me and remembered that I was in an underground prison cell, locked up and secured behind bars. I carefully climbed out of my bed and immediately went to pee in my metal bucket as I felt the urge to relieve myself once more. I went through the usual routine of pulling down my G-string thong down my legs, hopping out of the strings and putting the thong on my bed as I placed my buttocks once more on the rim of the bucket. This time, I peed for only about 10 seconds, but when I looked down at the freshly expelled urine, I realized it was quite dark, almost like an amber maple syrup. I thought nothing of it and wiped myself with toilet paper and put the lid on the now heavy metal toilet bucket. I again grabbed my thong from my bed, slipped one of my legs through the strings, and then the other one, and then pulled it up, straightening out the strings with my thumb and index finger, adjusting the position of my whale tail. Usually, when I wake up, I like to do some light stretching exercises in my bedroom on a yoga mat. As I was locked up in this prison cell, I realized that I had to adapt to my surroundings. I quickly thought of a new, temporary fitness routine. I started by slowly jogging from one side of my cell to the other, back and forth. I would jog from the bars of the cell to the back where the wooden table and chair was. At a slow jogging pace, it took about 2 or 3 seconds to reach from one side of the cell to the other, as it was quite small, but I managed to continue this exercise for about 5 minutes, jogging to the bars of the cell, turning around, and then jogging to the back. I must have looked like a caged lion pacing back and forth repeatedly, but I realized that this exercise served the purpose of keeping me fit and healthy. I usually jogged in a sports bra to contain my large, saggy breasts, but as my bra had been taken away from me, I had to just let my breasts jiggle around loosely, slapping against each other repeatedly. As no one was looking into my cell, I felt like I was all alone, so I guess no one could judge me, as the sight of my large breasts jumping around everywhere must have looked quite comical. I then thought of a genius idea. What if I used the bars of this prison cell to stretch my calves? I went to the front of my cell, lunged forward with both of my hands grasping the vertical bars, and started to stretch out my calves, applying a small amount of strain pressure to each calf. I then used the same vertical bars of my prison cell to stretch out my arms. I stood as close to the front of the cell as I could and gripped both hands once more on the cold, steel bars and began to relax my arms, slowly leaning back and holding that position for a few seconds and then pulling myself back up again with all of my strength. After a few repetitions of this exercise, I began to hear the solitary footsteps of someone strutting down the prison corridor. As the footstep got louder and louder, I began to wonder whether it was just a police officer doing a routine check on all of the detainees, as I had not seen another officer since White-Thumb Girl was extracted from her cell. My wondering would be confirmed as a petite female police officer stood outside my cell. Alyssa Penton in cell 126. You will be transported to Facility Manthorpe, about 2 miles away with all of the other 1-category detainees in this prison. Come to the bars so I can handcuff your wrists in preparation for your transportation. Yes, Mum, I replied. I walked to the bars and gestured my hands for the police officer to apply the handcuff. She locked the handcuffs on me in the usual palm-to-palm position, and then I thanked her. She passed a brown paper bag breakfast through the bars of the cell for the journey to the facility, and I was instructed not to open it until I was in the prison transport van. The officer asked me to stand back as she opened the cell door. As the door opened, it made a loud, screeching noise, almost deafening myself and the officer. She asked me to step outside of the cell so she could escort me to the transport van with the other I-1 category detainees for the short 2-mile journey up to Facility Manthorpe. I bid farewell to the cell that had been my home for the past 9 or 10 hours. That cell offered me a bed to sleep in, a cool wooden table, a chair, a tasty meal, bars to exercise on, and a cool metal bucket to piss in. I was so grateful to Grantham Police Station for taking care of me like this, and being allowed to chill out in that old prison cell was such a privilege for me. Clutching my brown paper bag breakfast with my wrists bound by those rigid handcuffs, once more I followed the police down the corridors of the underground prison. This time, more cells were occupied from when I first came down here. To be honest, I didn't pay much attention to the other detainees locked in their cells, as I had to focus on my balance whilst wearing handcuffs. I heard the odd shout or comment about how their cell is too small or the food is not enough, which could have been directed at the police officer as a pathetic attempt by some B2 or C3 category girls to change their current living conditions, but the police officer rightly ignored them. I was led up the same set of stairs as before, winding its way out of the dungeon-style underground prison back up to the processing area of the police station. The light was getting brighter and brighter as we ascended, and by the time we were 20 feet above the prison back on ground level, I began to feel a little bit disorientated as the sun shined through the large glass door close to the exit of the police station. Still handcuffed and still wearing just my G-string thong, I thought I was being led from the original processing area to a large waiting van with tinted windows. The engine of the van was running as if it was ready to transport a cohort of detainees to our facility, which would be our home for the next 7 years. Just as I was about to be escorted to the transport vehicle, the police officer directed me to a temporary outdoor gazebo just outside the exit of the police station, located in the car park. The gazebo was basically a transit point in which the rigid handcuffs would be removed from the detainees and returned to the police station, as these types of handcuffs were for the use of the police station and police officers on patrol across Grantham. They were not for general use, so instead we had to be fully secured and transport shackles for the journey to Facility Manthorpe. A police officer asked me to present my wrist to her so she could remove the handcuffs. She twisted the key into the lock, and one by one, each wrist was temporarily free. I stretched my arms and hands a little bit as those hinged handcuffs were always applied quite tightly. I had further bruising on my wrists as well as handcuff marks in various places too. The officer wished me luck and walked away back into the police station, never to be seen again. The gazebo was actually manned by the British Army with soldiers, mostly female, organizing and sorting out the transport shackles to be applied to all detainees for their journeys to their facilities. The soldiers were dressed completely in combat fatigues and brown berets, as if they were ready for combat. One of the female soldiers ordered me to put down my brown bag breakfast, stand up straight, and not make any sudden movements, as full transport shackles would be applied to me for my own safety and the safety of others. I was warned that if I tried to run away or cause any problems, I would be poked with an electric cattle prod. She was not joking. Attached to her belt was a large electric cattle prod with a sharp fork at the end of it, and it looked fucking sharp. A soldier reached into a drawer and pulled out a huge mass of shiny chains, clinking and clanking with every slight movement. I was completely awestruck by these glistening, delicate metal chains swaying in their hands. My heart began to beat uncontrollably with excitement as I knew that these were the most beautiful chains I had ever seen in my life. I couldn't wait to be restrained in them, feeling secure and safe. I'm not going to lie, but it seriously felt like I was going to have an orgasm. But I didn't. It was just an intense feeling of adrenaline. The first thing she did was put a pair of regular handcuffs on me in the palm-to-palm position like before. These handcuffs were actually the type with the chain in between the cuffs instead of the rigid type used before. I was really happy about this because I perceived chain link handcuffs to be much more comfortable, as I could twist my wrists up and down in different directions. These handcuffs had a special metal ring dangling below the chain link. However, at that stage I was not too sure what the purpose of this metal ring was. The handcuffs were then clicked into place and my wrists were secured. Next, she picked up a 4-foot-long metal chain, also with a special metal loop, which I soon discovered would be my belly chain for the day. She looped the belly chain through the ring on my handcuffs and brought the chain around my naked, slender waist. The chain felt really cold on my belly and back, so I shuddered a little, even though I knew not to make any sudden movements, as I didn't want to be poked with that electric cattle prod. The other end of the belly chain was secured through the loop at the back with a metal padlock, so it could not be taken off without a special key. The remaining loose chain was wrapped around again and secured with a second padlock. This was the first time I had ever been shackled like this, being unable to move my handcuffed wrists away from my belly no more than a few inches. The soldier pulled up the final chain. It was another metal ring with a single long chain dangling down from it. It had two shorter, individual chains coming out at the bottom. Each individual chain had an ankle cuff at the end of it. Using the same ring on my handcuffs, she padlocked the top of the leg shackle chain and straightened the long, single chain out so she could secure my ankles. She carefully ensured that each ankle cuff was clicked into place and correctly adjusted for the width of my ankle, which was quite skinny. She also had to double-check that all of my shackles were secured and not loose. A young soldier tugged at my handcuffs, pulling on them 3 or 4 times. Then she triple-checked the padlocks on my belly chain to make sure they were not going to be unlocked by accident. She yanked quite strongly at the chain with the ankle cuffs at the end, forcing my already handcuffed wrist to be pulled down together by a couple inches, which was a little bit painful. I wish she didn't have to do that, but on the other hand, I understood that she just wants to make sure my transport shackles are secure for my journey to the facility. Finally, my ankle cuffs were triple-checked to see if they were locked securely. She pulled at both of them a couple of times and made sure they fit my ankles correctly. If they were too tight, they could cause bruising around my ankles, and if they were too loose, they might move around too much around my ankles and make it difficult to walk, so I totally appreciated the soldier checking all of my shackles. It was for my own benefit. The soldier told me that I was all shackled up correctly and ready to be transported. As the engine of the transport van was still running, I assumed that they were only waiting for me because I did not see any other detainees leave the underground prison, nor did I see any get shackled up under the gazebo. I picked up my brown paper bag breakfast and I began to be escorted across the car park to the van by one of the other soldiers. This was the very first time I had ever worn full-body shackles with a belly chain and ankle cuffs, so I became overwhelmed with a feeling of nervousness and excitement as I began to take my first steps in my new restraints. I had made a bit of a mistake at the beginning when the first step was too confident and wide, causing the chains of my ankle shackles to be pulled too strongly as I took the initial stride. This caused me to trip up a little bit, placing a huge amount of stress on my ankle cuffs as they cut into my shins, causing a sharp pain in that area. If I was to actually fall forward in my shackles, there would be very little I could do to break the fall, as my belly chain would prevent me from extending my arms to protect the rest of my body on the hard asphalt surface of the car park. Then I managed to regain my balance and I began taking little shuffling steps, as this was as much as my ankle shackles allowed me to take. As I shuffled along, I was completely enthralled by the light jingling sounds of my full body shackles. The belly chain and the other chain connecting to my ankle cuffs were producing a beautiful tinkling sound that was like the bells on Santa's sleigh. I only had a few meters to shuffle, carefully coordinating one foot in front of the other, gently twisting my little waist in one direction, whilst moving my handcuffed wrists in the other with each little step. It was something of a strut as well as a shuffle, but that was okay, as I felt that I was beginning to master the art of walking in full-body transport shackles. By this point, I had reached the rear door of the transport van. Since I was in all of these shackles, it was impossible for me to step up into the van, so the kind driver lowered an automatic ramp so I could safely enter the large vehicle. As I clambered up the ramp, my shackles were clanking against the aluminum punch plate ramp, amplifying the sound of the chains. The inside of the prison van was like something I had never seen before. There were 6 cages, 3 on each side of the van's interior. If the cages were quite small, about 25 by 25 inches, with a simple cushion chair bolted to the floor. The doors of the cage were made of steel mesh, allowing the occupants some limited vision outside of their cage. But it was not possible to pass anything into the cage, as the tiny squares making up the mesh were too small. The sides of the cage were just made of some kind of hardwood, so it was only possible to see the cage in front. I noticed that 5 out of the 6 cages were occupied with other category A1 girls, just like me, but as I was walking to the only empty cage remaining, it became clear that I was the last girl to be locked in here, and the others had been shackled and caged for some time before me. A soldier opened the wire mesh door and asked me to step into the cage ready for transportation. I shuffled myself in, shifting myself into the tiny cage with my brown paper bag breakfast tightly clutched in my handcuffed hands. Then I made a 180-degree turn in little shackled steps, so I was facing the wish mesh cage door. I then sat down on the lightly cushioned chair provided to me, and I began to once more take in my surroundings. There were 6 fully shackled girls wearing our handcuffs, belly chains, and leg shackles, sitting in their prison transport van cages waiting to be taken to the facility. I heard the constant noise of our chains clanking against the metal floor of the cage, as well as the sound the shifting of our belly chains made as we tried to find a comfortable position in the chairs. I tried to peer out of my wire mesh cage door at one of the other girls opposite me. As I tried to lean forward to look out of the little metal mesh squares of the door, I saw another girl with long, straight, strawberry blonde hair like mine, average height maybe a size 8 with about C-cup breasts. She had very fair skin, beautiful cherry red lips, and bright blue eyes. She was really pretty. She too was fully shackled like me, but I could not see what type of underwear she was wearing. She looked so elegant and healthy, like a genetically superior Celtic princess. The transport van jolted suddenly, causing all of us girls to shoulder barge the side of the cell, making the sound of our shackles jingle loudly in unison. As the van started driving through the car park and onto the main road to the facility only a couple of miles away, We all repositioned ourselves on our chairs. Admittedly, as soon as I adjusted myself, I began looking at the beautiful lady opposite me again. Her eyes made contact with mine, and she gave a smirky kind of smile as she fiddled with the chain connecting her handcuffs to her leg shackles, looping the chain around her finger every so often. She began to open her own brown paper bag breakfast, ripping it open even though her hands were secured and restricted by her belly chain. She gently tore open the bag like one would open a perforated envelope, holding the bag with one hand and turning it gently to take out an overly ripe banana that was packed in there for her. As she pulled out the banana, she began to look at me with an upwards glance and started laughing, which made me laugh in turn. "Oh my God," she said whilst giggling. "This banana looks so sad." Her voice was really smooth and her accent was like a poetic Scottish. Next, she attempted to peel the banana in those handcuffs of hers. She rotated the banana so the tip was facing towards the ceiling of her cage and carefully began peeling the side layers. She couldn't fully move her wrists as they were restricted by her belly chain, so she had to fiddle and rotate the banana around slowly, passing it from one hand to the other. Soon, the banana was peeled, and soon she was sitting there holding a banana in her hands, thinking about how to get the fruit, with her handcuffs attached to her belly chain, still with a smirk on her face. "So, am I supposed to eat this?" she said, giggling again. "I think you should kind of lean forward and bring your mouth as close to your crotch as possible," I replied. The redheaded girl burst out into hysterics, resting the soles of her feet against the wire mesh of her cage before accidentally dropping the banana onto the metal cage floor. "Okay, there goes my banana," she chuckled. As she calmed down a little, she composed herself and leaned forward to the cage mesh once more, with her handcuffed hands still clutching her now open brown paper bag. "Either way, I am Kenzie. Nice to meet you," she said in a smiling, cheerful demeanor. "And I'm Alyssa. I guess we are cage neighbors today," I replied in a cheerful voice. We continued making small talk between our cages for the duration of the journey, not really paying any attention to the other girls locked up next to us. It felt quite enthralling to actually have a normal conversation with an intelligent, beautiful I-1 category girl who appeared to have fit the same mental and physical characteristics as me. We chatted about the process we had been through, especially that weird psychologist examination and the time in the underground prison. I later found out that Kenzie was about to study law at the University of Edinburgh and had been visiting her old school friends in Grantham when the government announcement came demanding the immediate internment of all young women. As her father was a civil servant in this newly elected extreme right-wing government, she felt like it was her patriotic and civic duty to surrender herself immediately for the cause to protect young women from debauchery and the breakdown of society. In fact, as soon as the internment was announced, she just walked up to the nearest police officer and asked him to arrest her and put her in handcuffs so she could be escorted to Grantham Police Station even quicker. She was really similar to me in many ways, and even though we were separated in wire cages, we immediately made a close bond. As the journey to our new facility went on, I could hear the other girls getting to know each other too, chatting away. Although it was hard to see, in one of the cages to the left of Kenzie was another girl, who introduced herself as Eleanor. Most of the time, she was standing up in her cage during the journey with her face and body pressed up against the wire mesh. She was about 5'8" with long dark hair and a tan appearance, almost as if she was Greek or Italian or something. She had really big boobs that were beautifully shaped. With every jerk or jump of the van, those breasts would wobble around like jelly as they were so round. She had a nice figure, maybe a little bit more curvy than me, but not enough to call fat. She had an average-sized, well-proportioned body. I guess she was a little bit older than me, maybe 19 or 20 years old, but I didn't know for sure. She shouted at me, "Hey, I'm Eleanor," as she tried to grip her fingers around the mesh door of her tiny little cage. "I am Eleanor. What's your name?" "I am Alyssa," I simply responded. It turned out Eleanor had tried to open a juice box that was in her brown bag breakfast. As she managed to remove the plastic cellophane from her drinking straw, she dropped it and it rolled away underneath the door of her cage, onto the corridor and into my cage. "Could you kick my juice box straw into my cage?" she yelled, trying to drown out the sound of the other girls and of the engine of the van. "I will try," I responded. So I got up from my chair and tried to find my balance again, which was difficult as the van was moving and I was still restrained in my full body shackles. Using my limited leg abilities as I had my ankle cuffs on, I gave a little kick and missed as the straw was rolling around on the metal floor of my cage. I maneuvered myself at a different angle and kicked the straw again, but instead of rolling into Elena's cage, it went into Kenzie's cage instead at this point. Both Ellen and I were shouting at Kenzie to pick up the small plastic straw and attempt to pass it through the wire mesh to Elena's cage. And Kenzie said, "What? I see a cute little straw." She stood up and kind of kneeled down as much as the shackles would fully allow her to bend over. At this point, her head was literally pressed against the wire mesh of her cage, and she was reaching down as far as she could, trying to grasp the tiny straw. As her belly chain was locked onto her really tight, it was really difficult for her to move her handcuffed wrist away from her belly chain more than an inch or so. Finally, she managed to pick up the straw, clutching it in both of her hands, although these stressful maneuvers had caused her handcuffs to cut into her wrists a lot, causing strong bruising and numerous handcuff marks all around her wrist. Kenzie's calamitous adventure was not over yet. She got up from her knees and slowly began to stand up, but as she stood up, one of the loops of her black, wide-back G-string thong got caught on a tiny broken piece of wire sticking out from the interior of her wire mesh cage door. She tried to pull her thong from the nail with one hand, whilst clutching Elena's juice box straw with the other, but as she lightly tugged, Kenzie's thong snapped and she fell against the side of the cage, lightly grazing the side of her face as she could not use her hands to stop the fall because of her super tight belly chain. With a snapped G-string hanging loose on one side, Kenzie slowly stumbled back up and tried to pass the straw to Elena through one of the squares of her wire mesh cage door on her right. "Elena," Kenzie shouted, "I got your straw but am bruised up. You only won," she said in a sort of exhausted voice. Elena poked her middle finger through the squares of her wire mesh cage door to try and grasp the straw Kenzie was presenting to her. Since there was only a few inches of wall separating each cage, Elena skillfully managed to put her middle finger around the straw and brought it into her cage. She managed to rotate the juice box between the hands and eventually puncture the foil seal with the pointy end of the plastic straw. Elena then sat down in her chair, hunched her back in order to drink from the straw of the juice box. As she did this, her huge breasts were hanging over her belly chain and literally resting on her knees. Whilst Elena was enjoying her juice, Kenzie looked exhausted. Even though most of the girls on my side of the kin could see it, she herself soon realized that her G-string had snapped. "Listen, my fucking G-string has snapped. What should I do?" she shouted at me in a panicked voice. I calmly advised her that she should try to maneuver her wrist to the snapped side so she could tie the string to one of the metal links of her belly chain. That way, her G-string would not fall down, exposing her private parts to everyone. The problem was Kenzie's belly chain was on her really tightly, more so than mine. I could move my handcuffed wrists about 3 or 4 inches away from my belly chain in any direction, but Kenzie could only move hers 1 or 2 inches. If she pulled her handcuffs any more than 2 inches from her belly chain, then she would cause injury to her already bruised wrists, but sadly she had no choice. If she arrived at the facility with her underwear falling off or completely naked, she might be punished. So Kenzie made the painful decision to somehow contort her shackled wrist to one side of her body to tie her G-string thong to one of the metal links of her super tight belly chain. At first, she tried to shift her belly chain up her torso a little bit, breathing in each time she was doing this. She could not lift her belly chain to high, however, as this would cause the chain connecting her handcuffs to her ankle shackles to lift to high, so it was a really delicate and painful maneuver. As Kenzie controlled her breathing, she quickly jolted her handcuffs and belly chain to the right-hand side where her G-string had snapped. In one final deep breath, she tied the broken G-string as quickly as she could in an almost frantic manner, and then painfully jolted her handcuffs and belly chain to the left again, centering her wrists so all of her shackles were back in the original position, bruising her already sore wrists even further. Alyssa pulled her belly chain back down to the original position, and the ordeal was finally over. Alyssa sat down in her chair, with the soles of her feet pressed up against the wire mesh cage door, looking completely relieved but exhausted too. As I sat, watching the entire ordeal from my cage, I began to think what a strong kind of person Kenzie was and still is to this day. She was locked up in her little transport cage in a friendly and good mood, ready to introduce herself to her cage neighbors until she decided to help out Elena, knowing that it was the morally right thing to do. And helping her, she injured her wrist, bashed her head against her cage walls, snapped her G-string, and then went through a painful ordeal to fix her wardrobe malfunction. But at the end, she still looked at me through her wire mesh cage door and smiled as if nothing had happened. I hoped that when we got to the facility, we would somehow share a cell or cage together, or be cage neighbors, or even get shackled together. I didn't know, but I did want to share more bonding moments like this together with her, in a platonic way, of course. As for Elena, she was actually a bit unaware of Kenzie's ordeal. Since Elena's and Kenzie's cages are next to each other, it was actually impossible for them to even see each other apart from their fingers poking out of the cage door. As the transport van was quite loud and many of the girls locked up in here were having conversations between their cages in every direction, Elena had no idea that Kenzie had been in a rather difficult ordeal just to get her plastic straw. This, of course, was not Elena's fault at all, so we didn't stigmatize or blame her whatsoever. Our transport van suddenly came to a halt, causing a sudden jolt once more. All of us shoulder barged our cage walls again, resulting in a loud clanking of our chains against the metal floor. As we all repositioned ourselves in our chairs, I began to assume that we had arrived at the facility since the engine of the transport van stopped running. It was impossible to really know, as there were no windows for us to look out in the transport area. Since the journey was only a few miles, it seemed obvious that we would now be escorted off the vehicle and into the facility for processing, as the drive from Grantham Police Station to the Manthorpe area was less than 20 minutes. At this point, I was quite hungry, as I didn't even get the opportunity to eat any of my brown paper bag breakfast. All I knew was there was a banana and a juice box inside, both of which were really impossible to consume because of the restraints we had on. I thought that I would wait to see what happens next before I even attempt to open my packed breakfast. Not long after, the rear door of the transport van swung open and a bright light shone into the interior of the vehicle, with the light being split up by the wire mesh door of our cages. Although it was a little bit difficult to peer sideways through my cage door, I could see a tall woman wearing a white frock. She looked a little bit older, maybe 24 or 25 years old, and had long dark brown hair and a slender frame. I looked at her very carefully, trying to determine whether she was a resident at this facility or not. I realized that she was wearing a set of heavy-duty metal wrist shackles. The chain on her wrist shackles was about 45 centimeters, so her dexterity allowance was quite generous compared to my full-body shackles. I looked down at her feet and realized that she was not wearing any type of leg shackles. She was only shackled by her wrist, and that was it. Instantly, I realized that this woman was probably a resident at this facility, as she wore what looked like a frock uniform and was shackled with more permanent restraints. "Good morning, ladies," she said cheerfully in an East European accent. "I am Alyssa, and I am here to unlock your cages and escort you into the Facility Manthorpe. It is very important that you listen to me, as I am here to keep you safe." With a large set of keys, she began to walk to the front of the transport van corridor and started unlocking the girls' cages one by one. "You must stay inside your cages until I tell you to come out," she said sternly, and she then made her way backwards, unlocking each cage until finally she came to mine. Very casually, she took out another key and unlocked my cage, causing the cage door to unlock and loosen immediately, swinging open by a couple of inches. Alyssa instructed us to slowly exit our cages and make our way down the ramp of the transport van and stand on a yellow line painted outside the facility entrance. We all shuffled in our shackles down the ramp, creating a really loud noise as all of our shackles were clanking against the metal ramp at the same time. I had to remember my shuffling technique as I shifted my waist to one side and my handcuffed wrists to the other with each step. As I left the van, I looked up at the brilliant blue sky and saw a set of huge black gates with an unremarkable-looking factory-style building beyond it with board windows. There were barbed wire fences and watchtowers on each side of the compound, almost like a prison or a Victorian-style workhouse. Surprisingly, I didn't see any soldiers, guards, police officers, or any kind of typical authority figure. I only saw a few other women, again aged maybe in their early to mid-20s, wearing white frocks and shackled by their wrists only. Given Alyssa's instructions, we lined up on the yellow line and we were asked to keep 1 meter apart. Next to Alyssa was a large wheelbarrow full of what looked like more shackles. At this point, I thought that it was not possible to be shackled up even more as we were already wearing handcuffs, a belly chain, and leg shackles all connected together to keep us secure. I am now going to secure all of you in heavy metal neck shackle collars and then chain you up together, she said again in an oddly cheerful manner. This is for your own safety and security. One by one, she pulled out each neck shackle collar and secured it on each girl's neck with a padlock. The lion, I was the 5th girl out of 6, so I knew that a girl would be shackled in front of me and Kenzie, the Scottish girl with the broken thong, would be chained to be behind me. As I was towards the back of the line, I could not really see how the neck collar was applied until Alyssa was getting closer. The process was taking a long time as there was just one lady applying all of the neck collars on her own, and she was shackled by her wrists herself, slowing her down a little bit. After about 15 minutes, Alyssa finally made her way to the end of the queue. She carefully pulled out the neck collar out of her wheelbarrow and opened the hinge. She placed it on my neck and secured a padlock to lock the collar into place. The collar was completely circular and was really heavy, made with cold and forgiving steel. At the front and back of the 4mm thick neck shackle collar were 2 shackle loops, one at the front and one at the back. My collar was now fully secured and I was now trying to get used to this new piece of jewelry locked onto my neck. I was now unable to move my neck down any more than a couple of inches, and whenever I tried to do so, my chin would press against the rim of my neck shackle collar. Kenzie, standing behind me, was the last girl to get her neck shackle collar fully secured and locked into place. As Alyssa was collaring her, I could hear Kenzie fiddle with her shackles as she was trying to find a comfortable position with her tight belly chain restricting her movement. I know that she was under considerable strain with her shackles already, and now a new, heavy metal collar was going to add to the poor girl's difficult situation. Once Alyssa had finished locking her metal neck collar into place, she then pulled out a meter-long heavy chain from the wheelbarrow and padlocked the chain from the front loop of Kenzie's neck collar to the back of mine. Kenzie and I were now chained together by our neck collars. Alyssa then secured another 1-meter chain from the front loop of my neck collar to the back loop of the girl in front of me. The same thing happened to the girl in front of me and the one in front of her until all 6 of us were chained together by our necks. Being chained to the other girls by our necks felt really unusual at first. It reminded me of those all-female chain gangs that I saw on a TV documentary one time, in which prisoners are chained by their ankles to go and pick up trash by the side of the street. But in our case, we were chained together so we could arrive together safely at the facility without incident as a team. Alyssa ordered all of us to walk through the gates of the facility into the main courtyard. We started shuffling along in a straight line, wearing our full-body shackles, chained together by our necks. We had to try and keep at the same speed because if one of the girls was walking too fast, it would force all of the others behind her to be pulled forward by our chains, making our chains straighten and causing discomfort as too much pressure would be applied around our necks. Conversely, if one of the girls was shuffling in her shackles too slowly, she would be forced forward by the chain in front of her, perhaps posing a tripping hazard. If any one of the girls tripped over, then the chances are that all of us would fall over, which would cause many injuries since we couldn't break our falls with our handcuffed wrists shackled to our belly chains. It was a really delicate procedure, and with each step we were taking, we had to make sure that the meter-long chains connected to our metal neck collars were not straightening out too much. Working as a team, we kept shuffling and shuffling, trying to maintain the same speed. I was super worried about Kenzie, who was chained to my neck collar behind me. As the last girl in our shackled line, she was most victim to the pace of our shuffling. Even her bruising to her wrists and ankles, where the cuffs cut into her skin, and the tightness of her belly chain, I could feel the chain connecting our neck collars straighten and strain with each shuffle we took. With each little step I took, the pressure of my neck collar on my throat would increase as Kenzie struggled to keep up. The sound of our shackles were getting louder and louder as every chain we were wearing was clinking on our bodies and on the ground of the facility courtyard. It was actually a really beautiful sound as the jingling of all of our different types of metal shackles echoed throughout the closed compound of the facility. Although it was really difficult to maneuver myself all chained up like this, I began to realize that my little steps were quite ladylike and elegant. I was learning to take little shuffles instead of big, monstrous strides like I did before I was interned. I was forced to work as a team to ensure that all of us girls would arrive inside the facility safely. I began to see the benefits of being shackled up like this, and the feeling gave me a sense of accomplishment. In a way, I felt a freedom that I had never felt before. Although physically restrained, chained to 5 other girls, mentally speaking, I had been liberated from the docility of being able to move my limbs freely without due thought or consideration. Alyssa guided us through the main door of the reception center of the facility. As we shuffled our way through without major incident, she ordered us to stop as soon as we were fully inside. Welcome to Facility Manthorpe, our residential facility for subordinate women in the I-1 category. This will be your home for the next 7 years. If the government deems you to be most receptive to its policy of intern women between the ages of 18 to 25, this facility will give you the privilege of being confined here, protected from societal collapse caused by rampant debauchery in which females are most susceptible. As A1 residents, we will feed you, clothe you, house you, and treat you with respect and dignity. But you are warned not to bite that hand that feeds you. Alyssa yelled, reading off a piece of paper. You will now be processed in preparation for 7 years of confinement. We will remove your shackles temporarily as part of the processing procedure. Don't make any sudden movements. Alyssa began removing all of our neck collar shackles and chains. She went from one girl to the other, unlocking each padlock so we were no longer connected to each other. As our neck collars were quite heavy and the chains connecting us together had occasionally been straightened and strained, we all had some minor bruising around our necks. She put all of our neck collars and connecting chains back into a wheelbarrow, and another girl, wearing a white frock and heavy-duty wrist shackles, wheeled it away back to what we would later discover to be the infamous shackles room. We were no longer forced to stand in a straight line chained to each other, so we all started shuffling around a little bit, spinning our necks and fiddling with our full-body shackles to find a comfortable position. Alyssa then announced that we would move to the next part of processing. Now, she said, you will be taken to the processing cages where your integration into the facility will begin. We were then escorted, free of our neck collar shackles, to a large hall with about 100 small iron cages lined in rows of 10. Each cage was numbered from 1 to 100, and I soon realized that some of the cages were occupied with some others being empty. We were each given a piece of paper with a cell number on it, and we were expected to shuffle to our assigned cage and wait outside for a facility officer to lock us in. My cage number was 73. So, I had to shuffle, still wearing my full-body shackles, past the rows of cages to find my new temporary home until I was fully processed into the facility. Surprisingly, I was allowed to find my cage on my own without being escorted. I guess they kind of trusted us a little bit at this point. I found cage number 73 and waited outside for a facility officer to lock me up. A few moments later, I saw Kenzie shuffle along in her full-body shackles towards the row where my cage was. As she shuffled closer and closer, still with her brown paper breakfast bag in her hand and a paper ticket with her cage number printed on, I started to have a feeling that Kenzie and I might be cage neighbors, or at least have our cages on the same row. She actually stopped outside my cage and said, "Alyssa, I've been assigned to cage number 73. Are you next to me? I have got the same cage number as you." I replied with glee and excitement, "Why, me check your ticket number once more." I shuffled up to Kenzie and grabbed her ticket stub from her handcuffed hands to double, triple check her ticket stub. It was 73. I was so excited. For the first time during this entire process, I was going to have a cage mate, and it would be Kenzie, that cool Scottish girl with a broken thumb. Alyssa, the same woman who applied our neck collar shackles, walked up to our cage and opened the heavy cast iron doors so she could lock us inside. Kenzie and I both shuffled into our new home with glee, acting all smiley and giddy. Chapter 4. Shackled up and ready to go. When we were fully in the cage, Alyssa slammed the door behind us and double-locked us in with 2 heavy padlocks to ensure we would not escape from our new temporary home. The rectangular cage itself was really small, about 3 meters long and 2 meters wide, with 16 vertical bars and 3 horizontal bars confining us along the front and back 3-meter side of the cage, and 6 vertical bars and 2 horizontal bars along the sides. Though our cage was quite tiny for 2 people. The cell had a very small cushioned stool, a rolled-out thin mat for us to sleep on, a drain cover on the floor for us to piss and shit down, a couple of soft blankets, and a jug of cool water with 2 cups. The furnishings were extremely minimal, but that was okay. We were happy that the facility had given us a safe place to sleep during our processing period, so we were both super grateful for the cage they had given us. Kenzie and I were exploring our surroundings, shuffling around in our tiny cage, peering out of the bars and checking out to see if any of the other cages around us were also occupied. Our cage was completely surrounded by bars, so we could see out of every direction around us. This was super exciting for us, as our prison cell and transport cage only had a viewing from the door, only with the other sides being walls. Many of the other cages were occupied around us with girls not only from our transport van but from other prisons and police stations too, all shackled up like us. I tried to look for Elena, but at this point I couldn't see her. I assumed her cell might have been somewhere else in the hall. Since we didn't recognize anyone, we kind of just kept to ourselves and tried to further our friendship. At this point, I unrolled the sleeping mat so Kenzie and I could sit down to give our legs a rest. We rested our backs against the rear of our cage with the cold iron bars pressing against our naked backs, and stretched our legs out as far as our chain connecting our belly shackles so our ankle shackles could let us, and we began chatting away about every topic imaginable, from family to work, from boyfriends to even sex. Kenzie told me that she used to be a debaucheress herself, having regular casual sex and numerous relationships with many guys in the past. She talked of going out to clubs every Saturday, getting wasted, fucking some random guy, and then feeling regretful the next hungover morning. Her hard-ass civil servant father ordered her to cut the crap and start acting less morally debaucherous before the new extreme right-wing government came into power. He called her group of friends on her own cell phone, told them to fuck off and stop seeing her, locked Kenzie in her room with only an encyclopedia, some self-help books, and the manifesto of the extreme right-wing party for about 3 months. After believing that Kenzie had been removed from her previously sinful environment, her dad applied extreme pressure on her to comply with the new government's order to detain all young women. Kenzie, not wanting to piss off and embarrass her dad, went ahead with her own detainment, and here she is now sitting in a tiny iron cage with me all shackled up. Occasionally, Kenzie would get up to peer out of the bars of our cage, but as she was doing so, she would position herself with the center of her chest in between the 2 vertical bars, swaying every so slightly back and forth, back and forth. It became apparent that Kenzie was arousing herself sexually by simulating her nipples against the cold iron bars of her cage. As she kept swaying back and forth, she would close her eyes and lightly groan, using her handcuffed hands against the bars to maneuver a swaying motion over and over again. I don't really know what was getting into Kenzie at this point, but she was really, really horny. This was extremely risky behavior, as acting sexually debaucherous inside the facility itself might get her downgraded to a B category, meaning transport from Facility Manthorpe to a more stricter, less forgiving mode of confinement. Nevertheless, I don't think anyone noticed Kenzie stimulating her nipples on the bars of our cage, so she appeared to have gotten away with it. I also noticed Kenzie tried to masturbate under one of the blankets we were provided with. She would wrap herself with the blanket, painfully maneuver her belly chain a few inches down, and attempt to rub her clitoris with her fingers, trying to pull her handcuffed wrist down as far as possible. I didn't question why Kenzie was doing this, but I had theorized that it was a mix of extreme horniness and an attempt to distract from the discomfort of her tight shackles, particularly her belly chain. Moreover, she had been locked in her bedroom for 3 months by her father in an attempt to curb her moral decrepit behavior. So perhaps she got used to simulating sex by rubbing her nipples on something and fingering herself. Only this time it was in the less private confines of a cage. I wondered to myself how much longer she could get away with this sort of behavior before she got caught. Kenzie sometimes seemed oblivious to her situation and just kind of lived for the moment, enjoying her time locked up in our cage. And then, suddenly, to our surprise, Alyssa came to our cage and unlocked the 2 padlocks on the door. "MC McAllister," she said, "it's time to get you processed. Please come with me." Kenzie shuffled out of the cage on her orders, and Alyssa locked the padlocks, leaving just me in the cage alone. As I saw Alyssa and Kenzie begin to walk away from the cage and down the corridors of cages, I began to wonder what the processing would entail. Was Kenzie first and not me? Would her shackles be replaced with less restrictive chains? Would I get some clothes to wear? Would she be moved into another cage, leaving me all alone locked up inside here, all shackled up? My mind was racing with both worry and excitement, and I started pacing back and forth inside my cage with my shackles clinking against the cold cement floor with each shuffle. I shuffled to one side of the cage, gripping the iron bars and peering out, before shuffling a few steps to the other side, again peering out. I kept shuffling, fiddling with my chains for nearly 1 hour, again out of nervousness and excitement. I was worried about Kenzie, and most of my thoughts were focused on her. I was kind of having an out-of-mind experience, shuffling in my full-body shackles in a stereotyped fashion, waiting for her fate. I had been locked in a standing cage, locked in a prison cell, and caged up in a transport van all alone, and now finally I had the opportunity to share a cage with someone and enjoy their company. But now Kenzie was gone, and I began to feel a little bit vulnerable. I suppose I got used to the company of having a cage mate after being locked up in my own confined space 3 times, with only my own thoughts to keep me company. As I continued to shuffle up and down, I paused at the side of my cage and peered through the bars once more, with my nipples pressed against the cold iron bars. I gently rubbed my forehead against the bars from side to side, and I began to feel a sense of intense pleasure and arousal. As my handcuffs and shackles restricted my movement for the rest of my body, I had to compensate with what I had control over, which were my nipples and my head. I soon realized that I was doing exactly what Kenzie did before she left our cage for processing. I was using sexual arousal as a coping mechanism, something that I had never done before. As I kept pressing my nipples against the cold bars, I suddenly realized that I was in an exposed cage and someone might be watching me. I snapped out of it immediately and started shuffling my shackled legs over to the other side of my cage and laid down on the mat for a short snooze. I laid on my side with my handcuffed wrists still restricted to my belly chain and fell asleep, feeling a bit exhausted. After what felt like a couple of hours, I awoke to the sound of my cage door swinging open. It was Kenzie. She walked into our cage, and Alyssa double padlocked our doors shut once more and walked away swiftly. Kenzie had gone through some kind of transformation. Before, she looked tired and slightly beaten back by her ordeal in the transport van. How she looked completely refreshed with a rosy glow on her face. Kenzie was no longer naked. She was wearing a sparklingly clean, cotton white sleeveless frock. Her full body shackles had been removed, and instead she was wearing these beautiful heavy-duty metal wrist shackles with a chain connecting each shackle by about 45 centimeters. She was also wearing the same style of heavy-duty-like shackles, with the chain being about the same length. It was clear that her brand new, beautiful shackles had been permanently bolted on, as they did not have a keyhole or any kind of loosening mechanism. When she moved her arms and legs, the heavy chains of her shackles made a beautiful clinking noise. I became super jealous at this point. There was Kenzie, beautifully chained up in these freshly bolted permanent shackles, and I was still wearing my transport van-issued full-body shackles, unable to move my hands freely because of my belly chain. She also had a freshly laundered frock on, and I was still wearing my red G-string thong, which at this point had been worn for over 24 hours now. I like to change my underwear once or twice a day, so I would have preferred to wear a nice, new clean G-string thong by now. I was a little bit curious about what happened to Kenzie's thong. It obviously snapped in the van and she painfully had to tie it to the side of her belly chain, but instead of a smooth round but like she had before, I noticed she now had a strange, kind of square-looking butt. She was wearing some other kind of underwear, but I wasn't sure what. As she greeted me, she walked with ease in her brand new shiny shackles to give me a hug. I could not hug her back with my wrists still shackled up with my belly chain, but I managed to grab her waist a little bit. There was a huge bolt coming from her crotch and also her butt. It looked really bulky and unusual. I didn't say anything at this point, however. Enzi told me how much she missed me, even for that short time, and that she felt so much better now with that super tight belly chain unshackled. Look at my new shiny shackles, she said excitedly, jumping up and down with glee, clinking them around and stretching her wrists as far as they would go. And my leg shackles. I can move my legs so easily now. I feel so free, she added with equal excitement. As she presented her brand new shackles to me, I began to feel the smooth, cold chains in my handcuffed hands, feeling each metal link, completely awestruck. They clinked so beautifully, and it was like a work of art how they were bolted onto her wrists permanently. They were made for safety, comfort, and security, whilst my restrictive full-body shackles were just uncomfortable and temporary. She could take little steps, whilst I had to take tiny shuffles. She could stretch her arms up and down, but my hands and arms were chained to this belly chain, unable to move more than a few inches. Whilst we were both chained up, her shackles were now at this point far superior to mine. I am so free, Enzi said in a gleeful voice, making me feel a little bit jealous. I can help you eat your breakfast now, she added. She walked to the other side of our cage and started to pick up both of our brown paper bag breakfasts. As she bent over, I noticed that she was wearing a diaper. An adult diaper. That's why her butt looked so bulky. I didn't know what to say about this as I was too hungry, so I told Kenzie that we should sit on the mat together on the cage floor and eat our breakfast. Since I was still shackled up by my belly chain, it was really difficult for me to bring food from my hands to my mouth, since my hands could only move up a few inches. Enzi offered to feed me my breakfast, tearing open my brown paper bag and pulling out a bread roll filled with scrambled eggs with complete ease. She brought the food to my mouth and I began to take little bites, satisfying my hunger immediately. Then Kenzie took out my juice box and pierced the foil top, so I could enjoy refreshing apple juice locked in the cage. Enzi giggled a little bit as she held the juice box up to my mouth, as it brought back the incident earlier in the morning when she tried to get Elena's straw from the floor of her transport van cage. When I finished some of my food and my drink, I had one big question on my mind. Kenzie, I asked, are you wearing an adult diaper? You mean a nappy? She replied in a cute Scottish accent. It turns out that British people don't really use the word diaper. They say nappy, which in my country means the texture of hair for black people. Kenzie looked a little bit embarrassed as she lifted up her frock ever so slightly. She showed me her adult diaper. It was a disposable diaper, very thick, super bulky, cloth back, and kind of clinical looking, with two blue tapes on each side at the front. "I am wearing a nappy," she said with her voice quivering. Enzi went on to explain that the drainage system was not working well in most of the cages, so as a solution, the facility recommended that all detained women arriving here must wear an adult diaper during processing. A is so we don't have to worry about peeing and pooping in the drain in the corner of our cage. She went on to explain that we can just pee whenever we want, and when we eventually get settled into our assigned cell, we can take the adult diaper off. Although Kenzie was a little bit embarrassed, she told me that it was actually really soft and comfortable, like wearing fluffy clouds around her crotch, tickling her with every step she took. I began to look and feel a bit perplexed since wearing an adult diaper was the polar opposite of wearing a G-string thong, but I knew that when it would be my turn for processing, I too would be diapered just like Kenzie. I had to ask her an obvious question. "Kenzie," I said, "have you peed in your diaper yet?" At this point, her face turned red and she started laughing uncontrollably, as did I. "Oh, not yet," she replied. "I do not need to pee yet, but when I do, I will tell you how it feels. Okay, Alyssa?" At this point, I thought to myself, of course, I could kind of imagine peeing in an adult diaper, but I personally would be terrified of pooping in one. In fact, I didn't want Kenzie to poop in an adult diaper either, since it would smell terrible and stink up our cage. I asked Kenzie what would happen if she needed to poop. "Well, I would use my nappy, but I will try and wait until we get assigned to our cells. I don't need to poo yet anyway," she replied. This was an immediate relief for me, since the smell of shit sitting in an adult diaper for hours probably isn't the most pleasant. Aside from her red frock, awesome new shackles, and her apparently comfortable adult diaper, Kenzie looked really clean and fresh. She went on to tell me how she was allowed to have a shower and wash her beautiful long strawberry blonde hair. She had some antiseptic cream put on her wrists and ankles where her old full-body shackles had cut into her. She was like a new person, whilst here I was, with messy hair, looking a bit haggard, still wearing my full-body shackles like a chained-up animal. Of course, I knew that my shackles were for my own benefit, but I still couldn't wait to get these temporary chains off and get some permanent, new ones bolted on just like Kenzie. A few hours passed as Kenzie and I were languishing in our cage, chatting away, occasionally eating, and most of all waiting for my processing to start. And I heard footsteps walking towards our cage, and it was Alyssa. "Alyssa Penton, it's time for your processing," she said in a cheerful voice. I tried to get up, but that was difficult with all of these chains I was wearing, so Kenzie helped me to my feet. I shuffled my way out of the cage, following Alyssa, and then she locked the cage door after me, applying the heavy padlocks, locking Kenzie inside on her own. Kenzie waved at me and shouted, "See you," as I shuffled away. I waved back, but it was a really pathetic wave since I could not lift my hands any higher than a few inches because of my belly chain. I was led out the hall of cages and down a few nondescript corridors. Occasionally, I would pass another resident dressed in white frocks and shackled much in the same way as Kenzie. However, these residents would look a little older than me, perhaps in their early 20s. Alyssa walked quite quickly as she appeared to be in a hurry. This meant that I had to shuffle in my full-body shackles really fast, making my chains jingle loudly. I twisted my waist to one side and my handcuffed wrists to the other as I shuffled. My belly chain was beginning to cause a lot of strain on my slender waist at this point. The cold metal chain links were digging into me a little bit, but there was nothing I could do about it at this point as my belly chain was padlocked into place. When we reached the end of the mundane corridor, we turned left into what looked like a kind of changing room with cages. There were about 5 cages with a shower head affixed to the ceiling, as well as a soap and shampoo dispenser on the back wall. Each cage was long and narrow with a brown grip floor to prevent slippage. On the side of the cage, there was a metal loop bolted to the wall with a chain dangling down, and at the end of the chain was a single handcuff. Alyssa ordered me to enter the shower cage, so I shuffled in and then she locked the door behind me. The cage shower door was similar to the door at the underground prison. Just 6 vertical bars into horizontal bars going across. Alyssa pulled out a set of keys and reached her arms through the bars of the cage door. She began to remove all of the padlocks securing my numerous shackles, starting with my to-belly chain padlocks. As she did this, the entire mass of my belly chains fell to the floor, making a loud clanking noise. The relief from the removal of my belly chains was immediate. It felt so good. I could now lift my arms up and down, and my previously strained muscles and bones caused a mass of endorphins to rush through my body. Next, she unlocked my ankle shackles using a tiny key. One by one, each cuff was removed from my ankle. As my ankle shackles didn't cause a huge amount of strain to my body, it didn't make a huge difference to me. I stretched my legs a little bit and that was about it. Finally, Alyssa unlocked my handcuffs that had forced my wrists together for many hours now. With another special key, she unlocked the restraints and I finally had freedom of movement with my hands. I was not a huge fan of conventional handcuffs, so this was a psychological as well as a physical relief. My wrists had been bruised up a little bit and I had cuff marks running up and down my wrists from the pressure of not being able to move easily due to my belly chain. Now, with a huge mass of chains at my feet and being unshackled and unchained for a brief moment, Alyssa asked me to pass all of the chains underneath the cage door so she could collect them and hand them over to the transport van company. Then Alyssa slid a neatly folded parcel underneath the door and she told me not to open it until after I had a shower. Standing at the cage door, now fully unshackled and with freedom of limb movement, I moved the parcel to one side of the shower cage, standing it upright against the wall. Next, Alyssa started smiling and asked me to come as close as possible to the cage door. Though I stepped up really close and rested my breasts against the upper horizontal bar. Alyssa pulled out a pair of large scissors, reached through the bars of the cage, and pulled out of the strings of my thong. She then cut off one of the strings, and then the other, and pulled my entire G-string thong off my crotch. I was completely naked and in shock. I loved my thong so much, and now Alyssa had just taken it from me like that. At Facility Manthorpe, we decide what you wear, she said in a stern but motherly sort of voice. I felt a bit pissed off at this point, but then I realized that being pissed off at Facility Manthorpe meant that I didn't understand that what was just done to me truly benefited me in the long run, but it had not registered in my head yet. Alyssa threw my now broken ridgy string thong in a trash can and then unlocked the cage door. She told me to walk to the back of the cage towards the shower head. She then grabbed my left arm and handcuffed it to the 80-centimeter chain on the wall, clicking it securely into place. She told me that I had to be chained to the wall for my own safety and security, and that I would be allowed a 5-minute shower. Alyssa left me chained by one arm in the cage and locked the door behind her as she went to flick a switch to turn on the water. After what sounded like a generator turning on, warm water started gushing from the shower head. It felt like pure heaven. I had not had a shower for such a long time, and now I was feeling beautiful droplets of water spraying onto my face, falling down my droopy F-cup breasts, rolling down my legs. With my unchained arm, I began to dispense soap and lather myself with a luxurious-smelling floral body wash. I soaped up my chest, rubbing myself underneath my breasts and my slender belly before lathering my long, smooth legs. I used my right arm to clean my chained left arm before reaching for the shampoo dispenser. Using my free, unchained arm, I pressed a large pool of shampoo into my palms and slapped it onto my chestnut brown hair, rubbing it into my follicles, scratching my nails into my scalp repeatedly. I then rinsed off my body with the last remaining minute I had. Even after 5 minutes having my left arm chained to the wall, my arm began to ache a little bit as it was not used to this position. The water to the shower head automatically shut off, and soon I was standing there dripping, waiting for Alyssa to unchain me. I understood that Alyssa was a little busy since there were some other girls having their showers too, so I had to stand in the shower cage for another 15 minutes until she finally unlocked the cage door. At this point, my arm was aching so much from being chained to the wall, having had the movement of my arms and hands severely restricted by my belly chain and handcuffs. Keeping my arm up for an extended period of time became quite difficult. Alyssa walked into my cage and unshackled my left arm, causing immediate relief as I brought it down again. She told me that she was going to leave the cage and lock the door once more, instructing me to open the parcel leaning against the wall. Alyssa secured the door, making sure it was fully locked into place, and walked away, leaving me alone inside the shower cage once more. Now finally unchained, I walked to the door of the cage and picked up the parcel, with water dripping down my body, still soaking wet. I used my long nails and I grasped the square parcel and tore it open. The first thing I saw was a soft red towel made from Egyptian cotton. How luxurious! Underneath the towel was a nice-smelling, freshly laundered white sleeveless frock, which was the same clothing I had seen by many women in the facility already. I noticed something else in the parcel as well. But surprisingly, there was a thick, disposable, cloth-backed adult diaper too. This looked like the same type of diaper Kenzie was wearing, and of course I was expected to wear it. This felt seriously weird, but I guess I had no choice. I had to wear this thick, bulky diaper like the rest of the girls. I pulled out and unraveled the towel, drying my body. I dried underneath my armpits, around my legs, under my breasts, and around my neck. I wrapped the towel around my head to dry my hair quicker. With both of my hands now free, I reached down and picked up the adult diaper. I ran my finger along the outside of the diaper, feeling the smooth cotton-like exterior. I then opened the diaper, folding up each side. It was really thick and bulky. The inside of the diaper was also really soft, packed with that super absorbent polymer material found in sanitary towels to absorb all of the pee. It also had a kind of wetness indicator on it too, so I knew when I had peed. I began to fold the side panels apart, which had the blue tapes on each side. I took the diaper and held it in the middle to secure the bowl form needed to contour around my crotch. I passed the diaper around my legs from the front to the back and pulled the middle up to my groin. I spread the side panels of the diaper to the right and the left, and I wrapped them around my hips. I started attaching the lower tapes on both sides and then the upper tapes, making sure my diaper was nice and snug. I checked the edges of my diaper, running my fingers along the frilly part just to make sure it fit well. At this point, I was all diapered up. I began to walk up and down the cage a little bit, so I knew what it felt like to wear my adult diaper. With each step, I felt my butt cheeks rub against the super soft back side of the diaper, and I also felt the tickling off the leg cuff frills against my thighs. It felt like having super soft, fluffy clouds hugging my crotch, making me waddle every so slightly with each step. From a psychological standpoint, it felt completely enthralling. I felt so protected and loved by this disposable piece of underwear. It gave me a huge sense of security knowing that I was wrapped up in this thick, soft, kind of cute adult diaper, protecting my modesty, but also allowing me to potentially pee anywhere, anytime. I knew eventually that I had to pee in my diaper, since toilet facilities in our main cage were apparently not functioning well, but this time had not come yet. I bent over to pick up my cotton white frock and slipped it over my head and onto my body. I straightened everything out to make sure that my frock was on properly. It was a little tight on me since I had F-cup breasts, and it was really obvious that my nipples were poking out of the fabric. Moreover, my butt looked huge in this adult diaper. As my diaper was so bulky and thick, The natural curvature of my butt had completely disappeared, but that was okay. I knew that my diaper was for my own benefit, and I was really happy to have one taped onto me. I also knew that this white frock gave me further modesty, and it identified me as a resident of Facility Manthorpe. After what seemed like an eternity, Alyssa finally came to the cage. "Alyssa, are you wearing your diaper?" "You must show me your diaper so I can check that you are wearing the items of clothing properly. Come to the bars of the cage," she said in quite a stern voice. I walked close to the cage bars and lifted up my frock, showing her the front of my diaper, and then the back. "Oh, Alyssa, you have taped that diaper on perfectly. It looks so snug on you. Have you worn adult diapers before?" "Oh, I have never worn one," I answered cheerfully. Alyssa went on to explain that all new residents in the facility must be diapered at first, and there was no shame in urinating in an adult diaper, since it was for our own good. Although I now agreed with Alyssa, I was really nervous about pooping in one if I had to. I hoped that Kenzie would not poop in her diaper too. If that would be gross, and it would smell like shit. "Alyssa," said once more, "you might have to wear that same diaper for some time, as processing may take a little while longer than expected. But don't worry, it can hold nearly 4 liters of urine, so it might get really full, but at least you will still be nice and dry wearing it." 4 liters of piss, I thought to myself. Holy crap, this diaper must be really heavy after 4 liters. I mean, carrying 2 large bottles of soda is heavy, but carrying around that amount of liquid absorbed into my crotch must be a really unusual experience. I didn't really think that I would pee that much, but on the other hand, it was really reassuring that my diaper was even capable of keeping me dry for that long. It must be quite an expensive, premium quality adult diaper. I knew that I was quite lucky to be wearing a diaper of that kind. Perhaps in some places, like hospitals, they give you cheap, crappy plastic-backed diapers that probably leak after pissing in it twice. I felt really privileged, and now I knew that this diaper would really keep me safe and secure during processing. Alyssa proceeded to unlock the shower cage. As she was dealing with the padlocks, she told me that I had to go to the shackles room where permanent shackles would be bolted onto my wrists and ankles. She proceeded to pull out a pair of conventional handcuffs. "For the safety and the security of myself and others around me, I will need to place you in handcuffs as I escort you to the shackles room. This is also for your own benefit. Please put your hands behind your back," Alyssa said very formally. She clicked the handcuffs into place, and I began to walk with Alyssa to the shackles room. Walking with handcuffs behind my back felt like an oddly liberating experience. I was completely unable to use my arms, but at the same time I didn't really need to anyway, so that was okay. It just felt appropriate given the circumstances. Here I was about to have my wrists and ankles permanently shackled for the next 7 years, so of course I needed to be handcuffed just once more so I would get to the shackles room safely. The shackles room was just a short walk away, and apparently this room had quite a reputation. It was one of the most unique rooms in all of Facility Manthorpe, and I was about to find out why very soon. After walking down numerous corridors for a few minutes, we came to a plain black door. Alyssa unlocked the door with a large, special key. As the door swung open, I saw a narrow corridor with a barred door, similar to one at my old prison cell. Alyssa pulled out yet another key and unlocked the second door. After 2 layers of security, we walked down a dark, narrow set of stairs. Alyssa had to help me walk down the stairs as I was still handcuffed by my wrists by holding my arms as we went down together. Several feet below ground level, we came to a large underground cellar. I saw another lady, maybe 18 or 19 years old, completely naked standing looking at me. She was quite short, with shoulder-length brown hair, a healthy body, and pretty appearance. Her breasts were a nice D cup, perfectly rounded, which complemented her body really well. As I looked down at her feet, She was wearing a beautiful pair of leg shackles, perfectly bolted and fitted to keep her ankles chained and secure. She looked a little bit disheveled, with a few black marks covering her arms and her body. "I am Scarlet," she said. "I am the blacksmith at Facility Manthorpe. I will take care of you today and get you all shackled up." It turned out Scarlet was the resident blacksmith here. Her position was very special. She was the only resident here that did not wear a frock and only had to wear ankle shackles, as she needed to use her hands to forge all of the chains. She lived here permanently in this underground basement cellar. This place was her entire life. At the back of the cellar was her cell, in which she would be locked in every evening, where her bed, toilet, books, TV, and other conveniences were. Scarlet would be unlocked from her cell every morning to manage the shackles room, where her sole job would be to bolt on permanent shackles onto the newcomers to the facility. Outside of her cell was an array of blacksmith equipment and, of course, shackles. Shackles everywhere. Bug shackles, arm shackles, neck collars, handcuffs, long chains, short chains, different combinations of shackles connecting to different chains in every style. There was a prominent blacksmith's anvil, a sway block, a forge, as well as an array of hammers and other tools. In the corner, there was a small blast furnace where Scarlet would heat up the iron to custom make her shackles. There was also a vent above the blast furnace, sucking out the fumes into the open air above. At the side of the cellar were a row of very small cells, about 6 of them, built into the wall. From this point, Scarlet took over my welfare as Alyssa hurried back up the stairs to carry out her other duties. "What's your name?" she asked me. "Alyssa," I replied nervously. "Oh, Alyssa, I need to get you shackled up, but first I will lock you up in one of those cells over there while I prepare some stuff. Let me handcuff you so you can move your arms freely," she said cheerfully. She unlocked my handcuffs and I moved my now free hands to the side of my body. Those cuffs were a little tight, so I had a few red cuff marks on my wrists, but I knew that they would heal super fast. Scarlet escorted me to the side of the cellar and locked me up inside one of the tiny cells, closing the sliding door, which made a loud clanking noise. She secured the cell with a heavy padlock so I could not get out. The cell was oblong, similar to the shower cage cell, about 3 meters long and 1 meter wide. There was nothing in the cell. It was completely barren. The walls were concrete, as was the floor, but there was a small lamp affixed to the ceiling. The cell door was barred, with about 6 vertical bars and 2 horizontal bars going across. This allowed me to peer out of the bars so I could see what Scarlet was doing at all times. My experience locked up in this tiny cell was different to the others. I was unshackled, dressed in a white frock, and wearing an adult diaper. I felt clean and fresh at this point, so I treated my cell like a hotel room without the furnishings. Whenever I get locked up in a new cell or cage, I love to explore my surroundings, pacing up and down, touching the walls, running my slender fingers up and down the bars, and generally trying to appreciate the atmosphere. Since I had been locked up so many times, I began to feel really comfortable in a cell or a cage. It felt like a secure den where no one could hurt me or attack me, physically or psychologically. It was my safe space, and whenever that cell door or cage door shut, my heart started pounding and I felt the adrenaline rush through my body in excitement. Scarlet looked at me a little bit, walking to the bars of my cell and gripping the horizontal bars with both hands. "Are you hungry?" she said. "We should get some lunch. I am starving." Before I even had time to answer, she walked to her much larger private cell on the other side of the cellar and took a tray of food from her bed, with her leg shackles clanking against the floor as she was doing so. She carried the tray to the door of my much smaller, tiny cell and placed it against the ground and sat down. "Alyssa, sit down. Let's enjoy lunch together before I start work on your shackles," she said, hurried and cheerfully. I sat down on my cell floor, sitting opposite Scarlet, divided by the bars of the cell. On Scarlet's lunch tray was a large piece of fried chicken, mashed potato with gravy, sweet corn, fruit salad, and some kind of fried potato thing, almost like what we would call a tater tot back in America. To be honest, it looked absolutely delicious. I had not had a big meal like this in a while. Also next to her were the cups of red-colored liquid, kind of like a flavored drink mix. She passed one of the cups through the bars of the cell. Alyssa, it's cherry-flavored, but it makes you piss like crazy. I see you have your diaper on, so no problem, she said, giggling. Scarlett invited me to eat, so I reached my arms through the cell bars and used the facility-issued fork to eat some fruit salad. She then shared the mashed potato, then some of the fried chicken until we had both completely cleared the tray. I was really full, but I felt so good. I washed it all down with that sweet cherry drink. Scarlett and I talked for a little bit after lunch. Apparently, 5 generations of her family were blacksmiths, so she was selected to forge all of the ladies' shackles at this facility. This was a privileged position. She had her own special cell made for her, and she was the only resident with a full-time job here as she had this skill. Moreover, as her work was difficult and a bit hot and sweaty, she was allowed to work completely naked with just like shackles on. On the downside, however, she lived here all alone. There were no cell neighbors or other interactions aside from shackling new residents, so I felt a bit sorry for her, but that did not seem to bother her too much. She was free to roam around the cellar, being locked up in her cell at around 5, only to be let out by a facility officer at around 7 in the morning. So that's 14 hours locked up in her cell to chill out and relax, and 10 hours to work in her blacksmith workshop cellar. That's a great work-life balance. After we finished eating, Scarlett cleared up all of the cups and the tray and put them to one side. Since it was early afternoon by now, she told me that she wanted a 1-hour nap before working on my custom-made shackles, so she walked to the other end of the cellar where her cell was and shut the cell door, without actually locking it. She paced her cell a little bit and then climbed into bed for a snooze. Meanwhile, I was in my bare cell thinking about doing the same, although I had to nap on the cold, hard, concrete floor this time. For the next hour or so, I paced my cell a couple of times, walking to the back, touching the wall, then to the other side, grasping the cell bars, and back again. I then felt the sudden urge to pee. Oh, I had to pee in my diaper. Usually, when I pee, I just sit on the toilet, relax my bladder, and out comes the piss, but this time I realized that I could pee in any position that I wanted to with this adult diaper on. Unsure on how to actually pee in a diaper, I went to the back of my cell and leaned against the wall to ensure some degree of privacy while still standing up. I closed my eyes, pretended I was on the toilet, and then released my bladder. My hot piss was gushing out like a waterfall. For the first second, I didn't feel anything, and then all of a sudden, I felt a large, warm mass of liquid spreading around my backside. It felt really warm and comforting and a little bit sensual. The super absorbent polymers in my diaper were beginning to bunch up with each release of urine, causing the curvature of the diaper to malform as the liquid had concentrated in one place. After about 20 seconds of peeing, the urine waterfall stopped. I began to lie down in a catatonic state, trying to register what had just happened. I had never felt anything like that in my life. It was an intense psychological process, and it felt euphoric. As I lied down on my front, squishing my big, saggy F-cup breast, head lying on one side, I began to just stare at the bars of my cell in a suspended state of numbness. I was so liberated from the curse that was the modern toilet. A piece of crap bathroom furniture that we had been forced to use for too long now. Whenever we needed to pee in the modern age, we have been forced to find that damn porcelain thorn like slaves to the modern sewer system. Now I was wearing this thick, bulky, soft, but now wet adult diaper, I could become completely free from this piece of sanitary hardware. As my thoughts raced, thinking about the event that had just taken place, I drifted off into a snooze, feeling so protected and loved by my adult diaper and the cell. All of a sudden, I woke up to Scarlett peering through the bars of the cell. Alyssa, Time to take measurements. I need your measurements for your shackles. She went to open my cell door, and I got up from the cold cement floor and walked out, just realizing that my diaper was quite wet and feeling bulky because the super absorbent polymers had totally bunched up during my nap. Carla took me to the workshop area of the cellar. Armed with measuring tape, a small notepad, and a stubby pencil on her left ear, she began to measure the circumference of my wrist, skillfully jotting down the measurements and even drawing a small diagram of my hand locked in a shackle. Then she kneeled down before my feet and started doing the same to my ankles, taking the measurements and making incredibly detailed notes. "Listen," she said, "you smell like pee. Have you peed in your diaper?" Immediately, my heart started pounding and I turned red. "Yep, I peed. Do you smell it?" I responded nervously. "It smells like ammonia. I use ammonia to clean some metals." Scarlett responded confidently. I then asked Scarlett if I could get a fresh diaper to change into, but she said that I had to stay in the one I was wearing until processing finished, which could be a while. Scarlett said these adult diapers are from Scandinavia, so they are great quality and they hold so much pee. They won't leak at all. This reassured me a lot. I didn't want my diaper to leak and ruin my brand new white frock, but I was a bit nervous about smelling like ammonia. I guess I had no choice. I just had to wear this adult diaper for as long as the facility told me to. After Scarlett took my measurements, she escorted me back to my cell and locked the door once more. She offered me a fresh cup of coffee and a biscuit, passing the cup through the bars of the cell. She then went to the workshop area, which was in full view of my cell, and pulled out some small metal rods, which she heated in the furnace until it glowed a bright amber, holding it with long iron pincers. Taking the hot rod, she hammered each rod on her blacksmith's anvil so it forged into a chain link, which would eventually become one of the chains of my shackles. She repeated the meticulous process over and over again, heating, then hammering the rods into chain links. I was completely mesmerized. I stood at the bars of my cell, grasped the vertical bars, trying to look as close as possible at the spectacle before me. As I was looking, I peed in my diaper once more, letting the urine trickle down as it was being absorbed, turning into gel crystals, further bunching up, making it more and more heavier and slightly saggy too. I pressed my thighs together to squeeze the crotch area of the adult diaper, and it felt so warm and comforting. I began rubbing my nipples against the cold, hard steel bars of the cell, producing an amazing sensual feeling, all the while cupping my F-cup breasts with my hands. I was in heaven. I was so happy. I was daydreaming in my tiny cell about having these beautiful shackles bolted onto me, permanently unable to be removed, and what I was dreaming was about to come true. I heard the bang, bang, bang of her hammer, and I smelled the distinctive smell of hot metal, knowing that this would be a very special set of shackles made just for me. Scarlett pulled out the molten hot shackle chain from the furnace and plunged it into a vat of ice cold water, creating a plume of steam, immediately cooling the metal down. Then Scarlett began forging the hinged circular wrist shackles, beautifully hammering a flat sheet of iron into the exact circumference of my wrist. Bang, bang. Scarlett was hammering away with perfect precision until the iron became circular, able to fit my wrist perfectly. A punch hole was made into where the hinges of the shackles would fit, and she made a cut where the shackles could be opened and closed. She again dipped the molten hot circular shackles into cold water before hanging them up. The process was repeated with the ankle shackles, however my ankle shackles were a little bit larger, so it took a little more time. Scarlett then had to connect the chains for each shackle. One chain connecting the wrist shackles and another connecting the ankle shackles. The end of each chain was heated up once again and race-shaped to harden around the loop of the shackles. Each shackle and chain was dipped again in cold water and left to dry. At this point, Scarlett looked a little bit exhausted, having to forge all of these chains and shackles, but at least the job was done. She walked up to my cell and stood once more next to the cell door, opposite me. "So, how about we get you out of that tiny cell and shackled up?" she said, implying that I must have been bored being locked up in here. Of course, I was anything but bored, but I was a little bit impatient. Scarlett opened the cell door and we walked back to the blacksmith area where I had my wrists and ankles measured. She picked up the freshly forged wrist shackles and held them in front of me. "Put your wrists on this anvil," she said. So, I placed both of my wrists, palm outwards, on the warm anvil. Scarlett opened the hinge of one of the wrist shackles and picked up a small bolt. With her hammer, she hammered the bolt into place, permanently securing the wrist shackle. She repeated the process with the other wrist shackle, again grabbing a bolt. After a bang of the hammer, it was in, and now my wrists were officially shackled for the next 7 years. The wrist shackles had a chain of about 45 centimeters, and they were really heavy duty. They fit around my wrists perfectly, not too tight, and not too loose. I played with the chain a little bit, feeling the bespoke chain in my gentle, delicate hands jingling away. It felt amazing. Finally, I had the same shackles just like Kenzie. Next, my ankle shackles had to be bolted on. In much the same manner, I lifted each leg, one at a time, onto the anvil, and Scarlett bolted each shackle on with force and precision. Soon enough, my ankles were now shackled too, and the fit was beautiful. I walked around a little bit trying to get used to my new jewelry. "I need to lock you back up in your cell for a short while. When you are in there, you can practice walking up and down in your new shackles," Scarlett said. She escorted me to the same tiny cell very slowly as I tried walking with these new shackles. Scarlett locked me up again. I knew I had to practice walking in these shackles, so I paced up and down the cell over and over again, trying to find the best method of walking with these chains on. I walked to one end of the cell, stopped, turned around, and then walked to the bars, peered out for a few seconds, and then walked back to the other side, pacing like a caged lion. I realized that if I lifted my legs only slightly and hovered my feet in the air a little bit with each step, I could let the chain drag against the cell floor, enabling me to walk more easily. With each step, I was getting more confident. Back and forth, I began to get a rhythm for walking in these leg shackles. I knew that running in these was impossible, as was skipping, so my steps eventually became much more ladylike and elegant. I felt like a model on a catwalk, walking in such a dignified way. The clinking of my shackles against the cell floor was echoing across the cellar. My wrist shackles, on the other hand, were incredibly easy to wear. I could pretty much move my arms in any style other than up and down in opposite directions. If I moved one wrist too far to one side, the chain would force my other wrist to pull in the same direction, so I had to coordinate my arms a little bit, especially if I was stretching or reaching for something. Soon, I became a little bit tired and sat down at the back of the cell. Once again, I had to pee. At this point, I knew how to relax my bladder muscles in order to pee wherever and whenever I wanted. So I brought my knees to my chest and I avoided into my diaper. Again, the pee gushed out, spreading out across my backside, producing another warm, comforting sensation. At this point, the super absorbent polymers had bunched up so much and my diaper in the crotch area had become really, really thick and squishy. I started rubbing my adult diaper, kneading the saturated diaper like flour dough, feeling the warm squishiness of the crystals inside. And I got up and started pacing back and forth a couple of times again. My diaper was so full of pee that when I walked, it was more like a waddle. The back of the diaper had become really saggy. The bunched up back of my diaper was slapping against my thighs as I was walking in these shackles, which felt kind of nice, as it tickled me a little bit. So there I was, walking in my beautiful new leg shackles, pacing up and down in a cell, with a super saggy adult diaper on. I wondered how much more my diaper could hold. But at this point, I knew that my diaper was doing a great job absorbing all of the urine. Eventually, I came to the bars of the cell, grasped the vertical bars with my shackled hands and just peered out, waiting for Scarlett to release me. After waiting for about an hour or so, Scarlett finally came to the cell door with a key. I am going to unlock you from the cell so you can go back to your cage upstairs to relax, she said. She unlocked the padlock, opened the cell door, and escorted me to the foot of the stairs. Alyssa, she said, you smell like pee so bad. Your diaper is full. I hope they give you a fresh diaper. Of course, I knew that I smelled like pee, and I knew that I needed a clean, fresh diaper, but I also knew that this was not possible at this time. I just had to stay in this droopy diaper, letting it absorb my piss until I was told otherwise. Scarlett and I said our goodbyes and we gave each other a hug. Alyssa returned again to escort me back to the cage with Kenzie. We went up the steep stairs together and exited the cellar, locking both doors. When I thought about it, Scarlett had a lot of layers of security. At night, she was locked in her cell, locked inside a cellar, and then locked behind a door to the cellar. Triple security. I guess the facility did not want her to escape or something. Her job was really crucial, but I think Scarlett liked her job. Like I said, she does have relative physical freedom in not wearing shackles, and she is allowed out of her cell much of the day to do her blacksmith job. As Alyssa escorted me back to the cage, she commented on how nice my shackles were and how they fit me well. I was really flattered. I knew that these shackles were for my own benefit, so I was really proud to have them bolted onto my wrists and ankles. As we approached the large hall with the iron cages, I could see Kenzie in the distance. She was so excited to see me. Kenzie couldn't wait for Alyssa to open the cage door so I could be locked in there with her once again. Listen, we have the same awesome shackles. So cute, right? She said, hyperactive and excited. Yes, I replied gleefully, hugging each other gently, bobbing up and down. I observed the skillmanship of Kenzie's shackles, tugging at the chains and checking out the fit of her wrist and ankle chains. Like mine, they were expertly forged with precision and impossible to remove or break. Kenzie and I sat on the cage mat on the floor and discussed the process of what we had just been through, from the shower cage, wearing an adult diaper, and going to the cellar, to the shackle measuring, forging, and bolting on of our new jewelry. At this point, we had become, in the eyes of the facility, officially processed, meaning that we had to languish in this cage until we were assigned our own permanent cell to live in for the next 7 years. Inevitably, this meant that Kenzie and I would be separated into different cells, as each cell would be solitary. As the day dragged on, we were still inside the cage together. Alyssa went around all of the cages, passing through our dinners for the evening. She slid the trays underneath our cage door, wrapped with foil. Kenzie went to fetch both of the trays and bring them to the mat so we could start eating together. This time, it was one of those Japanese-style hamburg steaks in a kind of onion gravy with some wild grain rice and broccoli. Balanced, but a bit bland. It was really easy to eat this time. My new shackles allowed me to bring my hand to my mouth without any difficulty. We stayed together eating silently through our meals before I collected the food trays and slid them back under the door of our cage. Without saying anything, Kenzie fell asleep on the mat. Her diaper did not look very saggy, just normal, maybe with just a few wettings. Mine, on the other hand, was dropping nearly down to my knees. I gave it another wetting because I had no choice. This time, the pee trickled down the back of my diaper and into the huge, squishy mass of absorbent crystals. It was heavy. Really, really heavy. And with sleep time approaching, I knew that I had to spend a night in this cage with this really soaked diaper taped onto me. Although I had the power to take the diaper off, I was not allowed to. If I took off my adult diaper, I would be severely punished, so no matter what, I had to keep it on, even if it overflowed and leaked piss everywhere. Don't get me wrong, I liked wearing my adult diaper. It was soft and comforting. But when it was really, really full, drooping down to my knees and smelling of strong ammonia, it became a bit uncomfortable as I got worried about it leaking all over the cage floor. I laid down on the mat next to Kenzie. I was on my side, putting my legs and knees together, causing the huge, saggy mass of diaper crystals to bunch together behind me. I knew that if I had to piss again, I had to stand up to ensure that the pee would go downwards into the squishy mass instead of trickling down the side of the diaper and leaking out. Shoot, I drifted off into a slumber. Just as the lights in the cage hall dimmed, I heard the constant sound of shackles shifting and moving around as many of the other girls had been shackled up too, trying to find a comfortable position in their cages. In the middle of my sleep, I was woken up suddenly by Kenzie. "Alyssa, help me," she said in a hurried voice. Feeling discombobulated and in a dazed state, I eventually composed myself and asked her what the problem was. Kenzie explained to me that she had to poop and she had no choice but to do it in her diaper. This is something I had feared the most. Of course, it was not Kenzie's fault that she had to poop in her diaper. She had no choice. I was worried about the smell a lot, and I was also worried about Kenzie getting a rash or something, but when nature calls, you have to go. Kenzie walked to the side of the cell and faced outwards towards the bars. She gripped the bars with both hands and started straining before releasing a huge groan in relief. After a couple of minutes, she kind of waddled back towards the mat of the cell, but she didn't sit down as she didn't want to squish the poop in her adult diaper. "Are you okay?" I asked Kenzie. Kenzie explained that she had constipation and when she pooped, it was a really, really hard poop. She said that it felt strange, having a large, hard mass stuck to her butt and she couldn't sit down or lie on her back for obvious reasons. Thankfully, I couldn't smell anything yet. I think if the poop was wet or messy, then it would emit a terrible smell. But because it was hard and compact, the smell was minimal to non-existent. So here we were, two girls locked in a small cage, both shackled by our wrists and ankles, one of us wearing a super saggy wet diaper full of piss, and the other was wearing a soiled diaper with a constipated poop, both unable to change our diapers, forced to sit in our own mess. It sounds almost comical in retrospect, and believe me, to this day, I still laugh at this strange and bizarre situation. Despite the weird circumstances, Kenzie fell straight back to sleep again, probably too tired to care about her poopy diaper. For me, on the other hand, I was struggling to find a comfortable position because of my wet, bulky diaper. I think it was beginning to irritate my skin a little bit, but I could not do anything about it since the removal of adult diapers during processing was forbidden. I just had to sit in it with no choice. But next morning, after a night's sleep that could be described as fucking shit, I woke up to Alyssa pushing two trays of breakfast food through our cage door. Since I was the only one awake at this point, I didn't wait for Kenzie to wake up. I just started eating by myself, having the banana, egg roll, and a small mug of coffee whilst leaning against the bars of the cage. My mood was not great. I was tired. My diaper was at capacity, and I felt like I was having cabin fever from being in this cage too long without furnishings. I was eager to have my own cell or a cage where I could call my home. I had been through so many temporary cages or cells, but like a pet canary, I was longing for a place of my own where I could relax and just be myself. After polishing off my breakfast, I paced the cage back and forth, waddling in my unbelievably saggy diaper full of piss. Then, out of nowhere, Alyssa came to my cage and whispered, "Alyssa, let's take you to your cell. It's ready." These words were like music to my ears. This was the final step in my journey to being a full-time resident in Facility Manthorpe. Wanting to disturb Kenzie, who was still sleeping, I bent down and lifted up my ankle shackles still standing up, not wanting them to drag on the cage floor, which would make a loud clanking noise with each step. With my left arm holding the ankle chain, I walked, bent over, out of the cage, and Alyssa quietly padlocked the door shut, leaving Kenzie still fast asleep on her own. I felt bad since I didn't get to say goodbye to her, and I was not sure if she would have a cell next time, but of course, I knew someone or somehow we would meet again. As soon as I got a few meters from the cage, I dropped my ankle shackles and started walking with Alyssa in an unusual manner, kind of waddling because of the thick diaper in between my thighs, whilst taking ladylike steps so I would not step on my shackles and trip over. I walked past all of the rows of cages, now filled with young women in various states of shackles, some completely naked, wearing full-body shackles from the transport van, and some wearing white frocks like me, shackled and diapered, looking as fresh as a daisy, whilst a few were a bit disheveled, having to wear a full diaper like me, itching to be uncaged. It was a surreal experience. I had been through just a roller coaster of emotions, and now it felt like I was going to reach my final destination, a cell of my own. Walk down endless corridors with many unmarked closed doors. Of course, I did recognize the door to Scarlett's cellar when we went past it, but that was about it. We were walking for about 10 minutes without seeing a single soul, with my huge diaper slapping against my thighs, going from side to side with each step. Finally, at the end of the long corridor was an iron-cast, heavy-duty red security door. It looked quite ominous and incredibly secure. Alyssa pressed a special code into a keypad to unlock the door. This was the first door I saw with an electronic security system. Every other door, cell, or cage was under lock and key. The door slid open automatically after Alyssa's code was confirmed. As the door opened, I felt a gush of cold air coming from the other side, which immediately made my erect nipples poke out from my white frock. What I saw was astonishing. The door opened to another building, and it was a really large indoor complex of cells. As I looked to my left, there was a huge set of stairs leading to 8 different levels, each with 2 rows of cells facing each other. There must have been about 100 cells in here, and it was really impressive. Directly in front of me was a large oblong window letting in natural light, illuminating the complex. On the right, on the ground level, there were some nondescript doors without labels. There was a smell of fresh paint and varnish, indicating that the cell housing area was a new construction, made just for us ladies coming into the facility. I could hear some clanking of chains and shackles from the cells, as well as voices chatting, giggling, and laughing. I thought some of the cells were occupied and some were already fully locked up inside their new homes. Alyssa escorted me up the staircase until we reached the 2nd floor. By this point, I was used to walking in these new shackles, and I was not too worried anymore about miscalculating my steps. As we turned to reach the row of cells, we stopped outside what would be my cell. "I am going to tell you some important information," Alyssa said. "This is your home for the next 7 years. You must enter your cell, and I will lock the door behind you. Like all newcomers, you will be in lockdown for 3 months, meaning that you will not be let out of your cell at all. Your cell is furnished, but you are responsible for the upkeep of your cell, keeping it tidy, and taking care of all appliances. You may take off your adult diaper and dispose of it in the perfume bag provided on your bed. We have also provided wet wipes to clean your crotch area. Our cell neighbor to the right of you will provide any other information you need." Alyssa shut the heavy metal door of my new cell, then turned around and walked away, and that was it. I now had to explore my new surroundings. Like I said in the beginning, but in more detail, it was quite a large cell at about 12 by 16 feet with a soft carpet, a desk, a bed, and a barred window at the back overlooking the facility. I felt relieved, like I had gone off a long flight. I had arrived at my destination and I had to settle in as quickly as possible. The first thing I did was to stand next to my bed and take off my completely saturated adult diaper. I lifted up my frock and undid the tab securing my adult diaper, causing the entire heavy disposable undergarment to splat against the carpeted cell floor. It felt like a lead balloon as it was so heavy. I then picked up the weighty squishy mass and threw it in the perfumed bag. It felt so good to have that thing taken off my crotch. I now felt so light and free, but after I took it off, there was a terrible odor of ammonia from the stale piss after so many hours. My whole cell filled up with this smell for a while. My skin was also a bit irritated as prolonged skin contact with a wet diaper can cause diaper rash. I used the wipes the facility provided to me to clean my private area, starting with my butt and also going into my vagina area too. After I had wiped myself clean, I pulled my frock down again, tied up the bag and put it to the side of my cell. I was now free from that piss-filled diaper and ready to explore the surroundings of my awesome new cell. I paced up and down a couple of times, feeling the cold vertical bars of my cell and then running my fingers along the side of the cell wall with my long nails. I sat on my soft, linen bed staring out of my cell, taking a few deep breaths as I took in the atmosphere of my cell and the surrounding facility. And I walked to the other side of my cell and turned on the small television provided to me. It was actually one of those heavy, cube-shaped pre-2000s television sets with a dial on the side of the screen. It had an analog signal and could receive the 5 terrestrial channels available in England. It had a preset volume, so it was so loud. This was because we didn't want to disturb our cell neighbors. I turned off the television set after a couple of minutes and then walked to the only barred window in my cell. It was quite a small window with only bars separating the cell from the outside. There was no glass or plastic barrier, just 5 short vertical bars. I wondered what would happen if it rained. Would rainwater blow into my cell? And what if it was really cold? Would my cell become cold too? I didn't know at this point. All I saw was barbed wire and a gray sky as well as some nondescript buildings. I paced myself back and forth again, trying not to trip up over my shackles. I realized to myself that this was my home now. These bars protected me from the outside world, providing me with comfort and security. There was no escape, but I didn't want to escape. I also realized that these shackles bolted onto me were permanent and complemented my loss of physical freedom whilst being locked in this cell. With every second and every minute that passed, the reality set in that the cell was now my world and I had to adapt to it, whether I liked it or not. Soon, the furnishings in the cell became, in my eyes, my property. This television set was mine. This bed was mine. The soft carpet on the cell floor was mine too. Even the bars of the cell were mine. They protected me, and in a way, I have to protect it. I have to clean my cell clean and make sure the bars are free of rust. I must make sure I clean the carpet of my cell and make it as comfortable as possible. This was my world, and I was beginning to fall in love with it. I laid on my bed and covered myself with the woolen blanket provided to me. Slowly, privately, I began to lift up my white frock and reach my shackled hands up to my breast, and I began to slowly cup and squeeze my large F-cup breasts. Cupping, squeezing, rubbing whilst closing my eyes. I was feeling absolutely sensual and aroused. It felt so good. I then tried to bring one of my shackled hands down to my pussy whilst cupping my breast, but my shackled chain forced my arm down and I had to bring both of them down there. I began rubbing slowly in a pleasurable manner. Here I was shackled and locked in a cell, pleasuring myself without even thinking about it. I was in my own world, and this was my domain. Underneath this heavy woolen blanket was a truly intimate experience of a physically restrained, but psychologically liberated girl. I pleasured myself to sleep and drifted off into a safe, secure slumber in my cozy bed, protected by the bars of my cell. After waking up naturally and peacefully, I noticed another girl in the cell opposite staring at me. She was tall, slender, and quite pretty. She was shackled, of course, like me, and gripping the bars of her cell with her hands. When she realized that I noticed her, she started waving enthusiastically with her right hand, causing the chain on her shackles to ripple with each movement of her wrist. Being only 6 meters apart, it was really easy to see and hear her. "Hey, I am Octavia," she said slightly loudly, bobbing up and down enthusiastically, grinning as she was doing so. "Are you new here? You just arrived to your cell, right?" she shouted in a slightly louder voice. "Yeah," I replied nervously. "I got locked up in here today, Alyssa." Octavia and I got to know each other as cell neighbors, having a conversation peering through the bars of our cell. She was a pretty, flexible, and slender Welsh girl, and I liked her immediately. Then suddenly, I saw an arm reach from the bars in the cell next to me. There was another girl next to me, another cell neighbor. The arm started waving at me, gripping my last cell bar to my left. I walked to the very side of my cell and tried to press my head through the bars, peering as much as I could to the left. "I am Gwen," she said in a nervous, soft voice. "We are neighbors here." I reached through the bars to shake her hand. We grabbed our hands for a minute or so. I realized that this might be the only physical contact I get with anyone here, especially since I was told that I was under a mandatory 3-month lockdown on my cell as a newcomer. I could see Gwen a little bit if I bent my head at the right angle. She was cute with dark brown, almost black hair, a nice round face. Gwen then disappeared as I heard the shuffling of shackles back to the other end of her cell. It would be some time before I got to know Octavia and Gwen much better. Of course, it would also be for some time until I saw Kenzie again, but that's a story for another day. I knew that settling into this facility would take some time and adjusting. My priority was about making this cell my home. This cell was my home now. I had to mentally condition myself for this new existence,